You drift into the city at first light, when shutters creak and the Tiber smells faintly of wet rope and fennel, and you follow the sound that always finds you in Rome, bargaining. It is not angry, it is brisk, like sandals on stone. Today you stand at the edge of the Forum Boarium, where cattle, grain, and human lives pass beneath the same awnings. You keep your breathing slow, like someone tracing letters by lamplight, because the scene is crowded and careful, dealers murmuring attributes, scribes lifting tablets, buyers lifting eyebrows. You notice how Rome can make anything into an inventory: height, skills, birthplace, scars, temperament, even song if the auctioneer thinks a buyer might be charmed by a tune at supper. You move closer to a wooden platform where newcomers wait with the calm of travel-worn people rehearsing stillness. Some ankles wear light chains that sound like wind chimes when the line shifts. It is less a rattle than a reminder, and the reminder is meant for onlookers as much as for the chained. A dealer rubs oil into forearms so the skin catches the morning, and for a strange second the market looks almost like a gymnasium before the chalk dust of reality settles. On each person hangs a small placard, the titulus, listing what a buyer needs to know. Gaul speaks passable Latin, knows vines, once kept accounts, no known seizures, no legal claims. You don't hear grand speeches, you hear lists, and the lists are what sell. Mainstream peg to keep your sandals steady. By the late Republic and early Empire, Rome's slave supply draws from conquest, piracy long since managed, into border raiding and policing, and the banal arithmetic of birth. Children born to enslaved women follow the mother's status. Large markets operate in the city and in port towns. Aediles oversee sales with rules about disclosure, and dealers attach placards to declare defects and skills. Prices vary like weather, cheaper for field hands, dearer for specialists. A trained Greek reader or accountant costs more than a vine dresser. An artisan versed in ship rigging fetches enough to buy 3 ordinary lives. Ancient geographers brag about certain islands moving astounding numbers. Historians still argue whether those figures are statistics or salesmanship, but no one disputes that the trade pulses through Rome's arteries the way grain does. You let the rhythm pull you sideways to a stall where a woman negotiates for 2 youths meant for a household in Trastevere. She quizzes gently, like a schoolmaster grading in pencil. Can you sew? Yes. Can you read labels on amphory? Yes, if the letters aren't drunk. Can you wake before dawn without waking the whole house? A brave nod. The dealer chimes in with buttered adjectives, and the scribe scratches numbers that start as clouds and then become sums. Light joke one, whispered near the scales. Do they know how to avoid breaking plates? The woman asks. We guarantee nothing about festivals, the dealer says, but they are gifted at catching. Even the scribe smiles at that. Rome likes a household with honest humor. If you walk 2 lanes over, you find men from farms inland peering at stronger backs. Latifundia lie beyond the city like patient beasts, needing bodies for vines, olives, and seasonal surges that can turn a quiet valley into a chorus of hoes. Buyers prod less here and talk more about endurance, sun, slope, the stubbornness of soil. One lifts a hand to show scars, and the dealer nods as if the earth itself had signed a certificate. Past that, a maritime contractor looks for rowers and riggers along the riverfront. His questions smell of tar, and his sums include winter. Quirky tidbit. Some dealers dust newcomers' feet with chalk to show they are newly arrived and not runaway stock. The sign says, Fresh. The chain says, Stay. And the placard says, Please read before you bid. The market's props are small: oil, chalk, cord, wax. But together they perform a ritual that turns biography into a price. You pause under a faded awning where a magistrate's clerk repeats the rules for anyone who pretends not to know them. Ediles require disclosure: epilepsy, tendency to run, legal claims, nationality, and specialized skills must be stated. If a buyer discovers a hidden defect later, a suit lies, return with refund, or a price reduction that teaches a dealer to love honesty. The clerk points at a tablet of posted penalties, and the crowd nods the nod of people who have seen penalties work. Gentle joke too: a bystander asks whether stubbornness counts as a defect. The clerk replies, "Only in senators." Prices float on rumor and season. A farm crisis upriver bumps the cost of sturdy hands. A captured workshop's dispersal floods the market with potters and drops their price until the kills find them. A shipwreck can make a good rower suddenly worth a lawyer. In the late Republic, a reliable field worker might sell for a sum that a middling citizen could save for over years. A literate Greek with accounts might cost several times that. A trained scribe with beautiful hands can be dearer than a small orchard. No one posts a single chart. Everyone carries a private one in the head. Historians still argue whether we can map ancient price levels cleanly across centuries. The safest truth is that skill multiplies value and fashion does the rest. Your feet carry you to the far edge where dealers manage the new fear of piracy turned policing. Rome boasts that the seas are safer now, but border raiders never submit paperwork. They sell quickly to middlemen who move people inland before questions can find a chair. The city's answer is to insist on titles, bills of sale, names of captors, the chain of custody like a chain of voices. Buyers in better togas ask for names and places twice. Some even ask for an oath. The old gods used as notaries when ink feels thin. You are not a judge today, you are a listener. You hear how the language of skill hides inside the language of need. Households want quiet hands. Farms want shoulders. Ships want fingers that learn knots fast. Workshops want eyes that measure without rulers. And the people being sold learn to speak their virtues like inventories. I know vines. I can keep accounts. I am strong and cold. There is courage in these sentences, and you allow yourself the smallest uplift in tone. There is also a path they watch for. The path where a skill becomes a wage becomes a peculium, and a peculium becomes a door. You will walk that path soon enough. When manumission steps forward and clears its throat, you note the geography hidden in accents. Thracian vowels, Cappadocian consonants, Numidian cadence, Greek that wraps around the Latin like ivy. Some buyers prefer certain regions for certain tasks. Cilicians for ships, Syrians for shopfront calculation, Gauls for fields, Greeks for tutors and secretaries, stereotypes that the city recites as if they were recipes. Historians still argue whether these preferences reflect training, bias, or the comfortable myth that the right label makes management easy. The people standing on the platform hear the preferences and resolve to contradict them for someone who pays attention. By mid-morning the sun slides along the awnings, and you see the market do something almost tender. A buyer brings water to the waiting line. Another tries to make a joke in rough Greek and gets a laugh he didn't quite earn. A girl in a worn cloak watches the scene as if memorizing it for a story she will tell in a safer room. You remember that household purchase is not all latifundia and mines. Many enslaved lives pass into homes where the day is laundry, recipes, errands, and a child's stubbornness over sandals. Intimacy follows purchase like a shadow, and shadows can be gentler than markets, even as they remain shadows. Light joke 3, the kind that sighs rather than stings. Two men argue about whether a good cook is worth more than a good accountant. A cook prevents war in the house, one says. An accountant prevents war with creditors, the other replies. The scribe notes both arguments and writes a number that tries to keep peace on both fronts. You step back and take in the whole square one last time. The posted rules, the oil, the chalk, the cords, the placards, the scales, the numbers. Rome turns human variety into ledgers with a mixture of cruelty and competence that makes you tired even when you slept well. You do not need to rehearse outrage. The scene already has enough gravity. What you rehearse instead is attention to the faces, the skills, the doors that open unexpectedly when a scribe decides to write a kinder clause or a buyer decides that a hand that can read is a hand that should. Tomorrow, you will follow these people into houses, fields, workshops, and ships. You will watch how labor arranges days and how law arranges limits. You will count coins saved in quiet corners and listen to manumission rites that sound like rain finally starting. For now, you leave the market by the river path, where the barges slide and the geese complain, and you carry with you the lists on those placards, because lists, in Rome, are often the first sentences of longer stories. You leave the market and follow the Tiber's curve until the city thins into docks and rope walks. Because to understand who can be enslaved you have to start where ships arrive and legions leave. The wind smells of pitch and fennel seed, a crane squeals, a clerk counts bales with a reed. In this hum you sort the pathways Rome recognizes, as calmly as a scribe sorting tablets into baskets. War, birth, punishment, and the murkier edges of kidnapping and sale. You lay them out on the quay like coils of rope, feeling which ones the law admits, and which ones it pretends not to see. First rope, war. Captivity is the empire's oldest factory. When a town surrenders or a field breaks under Roman formation, survivors become captivi, and by the law of peoples, ius gentium, captives fall into slavery unless ransomed, exchanged, or returned. The logic is as blunt as a pilum. Conquerors take, states negotiate, individuals become spoils before they become neighbors. Mainstream anchor to keep your feet on the planks. Classical jurists accept wartime capture as a recognized source of slavery. Yet they also preserve post liminium, the rule that a citizen captured in war who returns comes back through the threshold and regains status as if the interruption were a bad dream. A citizen thus stolen by war is not a slave by nature but by circumstance. If he steps home, the chain dissolves in law even if the scar remains. Second rope, birth. Partus sequitur ventrem. The child follows the mother's status, quietly writes futures. An enslaved woman's child is enslaved, whether the father is enslaved, free, or a senator sneaking through the back gate with poetry. The rule looks administrative, but it is also arithmetic. Owners count new lives as increases, and the law lets ledgers carry babies. You picture a midwife tying a cord, a steward tying another. The second is made of words. Historians still argue whether the rule's hard edge was softened in practice by manumissions at naming days or by patrons who freed mothers with infants. The documents show both severity and kindness, which is to say, Rome. Third rope, punishment. Some crimes end not only with loss of freedom, but with loss to the mines or the arena. Damnatio ad medullum, damnatio ad ludum, penal servitude, that is, slavery by sentence, not by sale. A condemned person becomes a servus poeni, stripped of citizen protections, marched to work where rock and dust take over the lecturing. The city uses this sparingly in high crimes, but with a willingness that prosecutors find persuasive. You make a note. Punishment slavery is a different species from market slavery. It begins with the court's ink, not with the dealer's oil. Fourth rope, sale and self-sale. Could a Roman citizen sell himself? Classical doctrine says no, citizenship is not a tunic to pawn, though a desperate person might simulate foreign status to be sold, and then claim postliminium if fortune smiled. Self-sale appears in moralists as cautionary tale more than ledger entry. Parents selling children? Early stories tell of famine sales and redemption. Later law frowns. By your era, a citizen child cannot be sold into true slavery by lawful act. Any such sale is brittle and can be unwound if the child finds a magistrate who still reads. Light joke 1. A satirist says some men are born enslaved to wine. The jurist replies that amphorae are not recognized masters. Fifth rope, kidnapping and piracy. The Republic once complained of pirates the way modern cities complain of traffic. Pompey swatted many, and Rome congratulated itself. But kidnapping survives inland as banditry with better shoes. Stolen freeborn persons, citizens or peregrines, appear in markets with forged stories. The law's answer is severe on kidnappers and generous to the stolen. If their free status is proven, they return. Buyers lose coin and learn to love receipts. Aediles demand placards. Governors demand provenance. Honest dealers demand witnesses who can remember more than adjectives. Light joke 2. A dealer boasts he never buys without papers. A buyer says he never buys without doubts. The clerk says he sells nothing but warnings. Sixth rope, exposure and foundlings. The city has doorways where desperate parents leave infants with prayers made of silence. Temples, patrons, and the soft economy of neighbors sometimes rescue and foster. Sometimes foundlings are raised as household slaves who later become loyal freedmen. Sometimes they are sold early and forget the doorway. Jurists notice without triumph. Their sentences suggest a moral whether. Do what custom praises. Do not turn foundlings into profit without a conscience that can sleep. Seventh rope, provincial status. Conquered peoples without citizenship can be enslaved in war. But a free peregrine taken in peace by fraud is not lawfully enslaved. Governors in your Section 13 world invite petitions from those wronged, and archives preserve neat reversals where a provincial shows a baptism of tax rolls and walks out free. The empire likes order more than it likes cleverness. Kidnappers generate disorder. Therefore, governors frown theatrically and write with pleasure. You pause and draw a thin line with your stylus across the plank. Debt. Early Rome knew nexum, a grim dead bondage that could end in servitude. The 12 tables rattle with that older metal. But by the classical period, debt imprisonment yields to property seizure and estate sales. Bonorum venditio, distractio, because commerce prefers assets to bodies. A free Roman who owes money may lose goods, reputation, and dinner invitations. He should not lawfully become merchandise. You store the comfort as policy, not as guarantee, because practice in alleys always tests doctrine. Light joke 3. A creditor says he wants the debtor's pound of flesh. The praetor says, "We are out of stock but have a fine selection of furniture." Now you trace the legal nets that keep citizens from falling permanently through war or fraud. Postliminium, already humming, restores status to captives returning. Falsy, forgery, prosecutions bite sellers of free persons. Interdict to rescue the unlawfully detained. Patrons and relatives serve as informal detectives. Inscriptions tell of loved ones ransoming captives through clubby associations. Papyri tell of letters begging governors to verify born free claims. Manumission certificates tell of patrons freeing those they once purchased, perhaps because a story in a kitchen asked for repair. Mainstream aside, precise enough to pin, classical texts list slavery's causes as capture, birth from an enslaved mother, and sometimes punishment. Late antique compilations add technical routes, evasion of draft. Certain illicit acts that courts bundle into penal categories. What you do not see canonized is the casual sale of citizens. What you do see is endless paperwork about proving who is who, because cities as large as empires cannot rely on faces alone. You sit on a bollard and let the human map of the city float past. Cappadocian porters who came in chains and now rent time to others. A Greek boy with ink-stained fingers who will become a freedman notary. A Thracian girl who will measure out cumin for a lifetime and buy her mother a cloak. A Roman soldier's son who fell into bandit hands, then came home via a governor's seal and a cousin's stubbornness. Some were enslaved by war, some by birth, some by sentence, some by theft. All live inside rules the city calls natural, even when philosophers tease the word, nature, until it blushes. Which brings you to the last coil, ideas. Stoic philosophers insist that all humans share reason. They say slavery is a matter of law, not nature, a costume that fits too tightly to be eternal. Jurists smile and agree politely in prefaces while drafting ironclad contracts in the body of the text. Historians still argue whether such ideals soften practice. Did Stoicism really loosen chains, or did it simply make clever patrons feel thoughtful? The ledger shows manumissions in numbers large enough to be social facts. The mines show that kindness did not visit every valley.by late afternoon the quay glows like a copper coin, and you can see how the categories, tidy in books, tangle in lives. A woman born enslaved to a cook becomes a midwife and saves enough for a peculium. A captive who returns under postliminium brings back nightmares that no clerk can stamp. A condemned thief sent to the quarries stops being a client and becomes a rumor. The law's boxes are needed. The city's stories leak between them like water through wicker.so. You leave the harbor with your own inventory, not of people, but of rules. Capture recognized but reversible for citizens. Birth as arithmetic that good patrons sometimes erase. Punishment as slavery with a date and a destination. Self-sale forbidden in doctrine even when poverty improvises. Kidnapping punished and unwound when proven. Foundlings hovering between mercy and markets. Provincial law. Watched by governors who prefer petitions to swords. Tomorrow you will step into houses and fields where these ropes are pulled tight or quietly loosened by habit and hope. For tonight you keep one sentence as a lull in your throat. Who may be enslaved is a question the law answers briskly and the city answers slowly. One rescue, one sale, one manumission, one memory at a time. You step through a doorway painted with a garden that isn't real, vines curling up a wall, tiny birds perched forever on plaster. And you enter the kind of Roman house where everything whispers hierarchy under the perfume. The floor mosaics imitate rivers. The impluvium gathers a square of sky. The steward, who has the keys, gathers everything else. Here the enslaved are not only hands. They are routines, voices, and memory. You move softly, because household work is choreography, and you're entering mid-step. The day starts before yours. A young woman from the kitchen wing pads across cool stone with a brazier and a bundle of kindling, coaxing embers like an ant coaxing a story out of a shy child. Someone else lifts shutters, checks the rainwater level, sweeps yesterday into a neat line dust can't cross. A boy polishes the bronze of the household gods until the Lauras look freshly awake. By the time your sandals arrive, the house has already performed 3 hours of invisibility. Light joke 1, a lazy guest says. I woke with the dawn. The cook mutters. How nice for the dawn. You follow the steward, villicus within, dispensator at the books, who knows the household's pulse the way a singer knows a chorus. He can name where the olive oil sits, which salt jar has virtue, and what line of the master's account tablet proves the fishmonger is optimistic. The steward is enslaved, yes, but he is also power on loan, and his key ring says he is trusted enough to be feared a little. He directs a lattice of roles, the ostiarius at the door, the triclinarchs who stages meals, the cubicularii who tend bedrooms and secrets, the nurse who is everyone's real weather. You settle near the atrium as a child staggers by in a tunic that has ambitions to trip him. The nurse catches him by a loop she sewed into the shoulder. Her invention, she will tell you later, for children who like stairs too much. She is enslaved and still a boundary stone. Her no carries more weight than nicer words spoken by people who technically own the house. If the child grows into a decent adult, he will call her mother when fever comes and nurse when ceremony arrives. Either word will be true. Mainstream anchor to keep the room square. Literary sources and inscriptions tell us that elite Roman households ran on specialized enslaved labor. Cooks, hairdressers, ornatrices, readers, anagnosti, secretaries, librarii, bookkeepers, dispensators, doorkeepers, water carriers, wet nurses, tutors. Many were highly trained. Some were educated to a degree that would embarrass middling senators on a day when nouns refused to behave. Freedom could come by will, by purchase with peculium, or by a patron's favor. Until then, the house was both workplace and world. You spend an hour in the kitchen where an older cook, Cappadocian by accent, impatient by art, conducts the day's menu like a small war. He tastes garum and frowns at the faint brag of too much anchovy. He pinches cumin with 2 fingers that have memorized measures without scales. He calls for meridum season like a field at noon, and a roast that tastes like the word after. When a junior cook suggests honey, the master of sauces taps the spoon on the boy's knuckles, not hard, just enough to say, "We sweeten last." The kitchen's hierarchy is clearer than marble law, and yet you hear laughter when the pot refuses to stop boiling, because pots, like people, learn slowly. In the peristyle, a hairdresser draws a line of light down a matron's hair with an ivory comb, divides, twists, and pins until architecture sits on a head. The matron winces, then apologizes. The ornatrix smiles the smile of someone who has seen larger pain and smaller courtesy. They speak in code about guests. She prefers pearls, meaning caution. He prefers olives, meaning send the witty slave to pour his wine. Work here isn't only hands. It is reading faces that think they are unreadable. Letters arrive. A literate enslaved secretary reads them aloud in a tone that doesn't mock, even when the writer deserves it. He has that most Roman of luxuries, access to the master's ear. He drafts replies, files past quarrels, remembers what the senator from across town confessed after a third cup. His literacy is a ladder he climbs and also a leash that pulls. Historians still argue whether proximity to power softened bondage or made its contradictions sharper. Does a trusted slave sleep better, or does he simply learn to dream cautiously? The archives yield manumissions and betrayals. The poetry yields jokes. The truth sits between the lamp and the ledger. Intimacy is the house's ambient temperature. The cubicularius knows which cloak is lucky, which sandals squeak, which ring should not be worn near the man who cannot stop counting. The triclinarchs knows which guest will eat olives only if they've been embarrassed in brine. The nurse knows who cried last night, and why it wasn't only the onion. These are political facts inside domestic walls, and they are gathered by people who are both subordinate and essential. Light joke too, the steward says the master. Trusts me with everything except his poetry, the secretary says. He also trusts you not to read it. Not everything is polished. There are punishments you prefer to leave off stage, but the thread hums like a bad instrument, the rod, the chain, the brand. Some houses prefer fines from peculium to marks on skin. Others display cruelty the way some display imported bronze. The law allows too much. Custom, shame, and the watchful eyes of neighbors sometimes allow less. A rumor that a master overuses the lash can cost invitations, which in Rome is a currency not listed on tablets. You sense the house negotiating itself every day between discipline and disgrace. Quirky tidbit: some households trained enslaved readers to perform tragedies and comedies during dinners. Elite guests would hush to hear a slave declaim Euripides while a carver achieved geometry in roast boar. A good voice could change a day's mood. A good memory could change a life. Reciting a patron's genealogy without letters was a payable miracle. When the house naps, you don't. You watch the quiet economy of peculium. The private stash an owner permits a slave to manage. A kitchen girl sells leftover herbs to a neighbor and keeps the coin in a jar the steward pretends not to notice. A porter rents out an afternoon of lifting to a shop next door. The secretary copies a fair hand for a fee in the margins of his sleep. Peculium is hope with arithmetic, and arithmetic is how hope becomes manumission eventually. It is also a trust test the house runs daily. Give responsibility. Watch it multiply. Reward the multiplication with a little more room to breathe. Sex is here too, and the house does not always deserve euphemism. Concubinage can be tenderness or exploitation or both within the same week. The enslaved bear the weight of desire that thinks of itself as right. The law will recognize children if the master later manumits the mother and marries her. The law will also shrug when a promise dries up. You hold this part of the house gently, with more silence than sentences, and say only that intimacy can save and scorch in the same bed. You follow the day into the afternoon when the master rehearses clients and the mistress rehearses courtesies, and both rely on enslaved people to remember the lines, fetch the props, and judge the audience. A doorkeeper's pause can decide whether a rival enters now or after the important man leaves. A couch arranger's glance can unite allies who didn't know they were allies. A wine pourer's timing can prevent a quarrel by interrupting it with sweetness. Domestic work is not only work, it is politics expressed as napkin folds and footstool angles. Mainstream fact, cool as a cistern, inscriptions set up by freedmen and free women, often former household slaves, show careers built from these rooms. Dispensator Augusti, chief steward of the emperor's accounts, a cubiculo of the imperial bedchamber, A manu, the emperor's secretary, a bipistulus, of letters. The imperial household is a city of households, and skilled enslaved staff climb to positions where their signatures change days. The private house is the small version of that ladder, steward to freedman, freedman to contractor, contractor to patron in his own right. Evening returns with lamps and plates. The triclinarch stages the dinner like a public holiday performed in miniature, reclining order, dish order, anecdote order. The anagnos reads. The cook receives praise that arrives disguised as criticism. The doorkeeper escorts away the man who has turned one last story into 3. Light joke 3. The master compliments the wine. The steward replies, "We kept the amphora from learning poetry." Everyone understands that means, "We didn't water it." When the house folds into night, you stand again by the painted garden and feel how duty and trust have braided themselves across the day. The enslaved here are not simply labor, they are relationship. They know birthdays, recipes, accounts, and tempers. They carry keys, letters, and gossip. They stand in doorways where law and affection argue in a whisper. Historians still argue whether the intimacy of domestic slavery made Roman households kinder than their laws or simply better at hiding contradictions. The safest sentence is that intimacy increased stakes. A good house could be very good. A bad one could be exquisitely cruel. You leave by the side gate, where the nurse hangs tomorrow's little tunic on a peg and tucks the loop in with a pat. You picture her decades hence, manumitted, living nearby with a small pension and a large reputation, still summoned when someone falls sick. You picture the secretary saving for a seal, the cook promising to teach a freed apprentice how not to burn garlic, the steward calculating a dowry for a daughter who will never lift shutters before dawn. Domestic bondage in Rome blurs into family where it can, into theater where it must, into ledgers where it has to. You walk home on streets that smell of lamp oil and fennel, and you carry with you the sound of unseen work folding a city's day closed. You leave the painted garden and walk until stucco gives way to wind, out along the Appian, past tombs that pretend to be little houses, into a landscape that smells of dust and olives. Fields, mines, and mills, Rome's quiet machinery. The city eats because the countryside keeps time. The countryside keeps time because a steward with a wax tablet and a temper believes in columns that add up. You step onto a latifundium at dawn and feel the day begin like a wheel that has already been turning for hours. The villicus meets you with a bundle of keys and a face that has memorized weather. His wife, the villica, has a different set of keys and the kind of voice that can move bread from oven to baskets without raising itself. Enslaved gangs sleep in long barracks, the feared gasculum if the owner prefers locks to lullabies, then file out by task, vine dressers, olive beaters, plow teams, pruners, ditch diggers, cart drivers. Cato would approve the choreography. Columella would rewrite it with kinder punctuation. The steward will take either if yields arrive when arithmetic says they should. You watch pruning done as if the vines were shy livestock, carefully, with a rhythm that looks like music if you squint. The men joke softly. The vine answers with sap. A boy collects the cuttings for fuel. An older man sorts them for grafting. The overseer counts rows aloud, not because he doubts the hands but because counting is how mornings stay sane. Light joke 1. A new worker asks how many rows make a good day. The overseer says, "One more than yesterday if the weather behaves." Mainstream pegged to set under your feet. Ancient authors and inscriptions agree that large estates, latifundia, dominated certain regions, southern Italy, Sicily, North Africa, using gangs of enslaved laborers under overseers. Smaller farms and tenant plots thrived elsewhere. Seasonal work surged, harvest, olive beating, vintage, with hired free labor often joining enslaved crews. Manuals by Cato, Varro, and Columella obsess over tools, rations, schedules, the villicous character, and the perils of letting a city-bred master micromanage vines from a couch. You pass an olive yard after first beating. Nets hold fruit like patient fish. Two women sing a work song that keeps branches from bruising. Rhythm equalizes arms. Nearby, a press creaks. The screw descends with the unflustered authority of things that have crushed before. The first run is bright and peppery, the second a little resigned. The steward labels amphory with a brush as if writing poems you can pour. Past the olives the ground lifts, and carts rumble toward a quarry where rock wakes up to its fate. Blocks emerge from a face cut with iron wedges and patient water, cunei and soaked pegs widening seams until marble size. At Luna, Carrara, the stone is snow that doesn't melt. In Egypt's eastern desert at Mons Claudianus the granite is night with stars inside. In Numidia the giallo antico is butter that turned to stone just when the gods were hungry. You stand aside as a team slides a block onto a sledge, greased tracks groaning like old knees. A foreman makes a sign with two fingers to ward off bad luck. The men echo it without looking. Quirky tidbit. Quarry crews sometimes scratch little donkeys and ships onto the rock walls. Graffiti prayers that the stone would travel safely and their wages would not vanish into sand. Mines pull you lower still, into galleries lit by lamps whose smoke draws a black ceiling on every day. Silver in Spain, lead and copper at Rio Tinto, gold in Dacia, tin at the edges of maps. The empire's arteries run with or where water runs with fatigue. Not every miner is enslaved. Free and freedmen contractors bid on seams and hire who they can. But punishments, damnatio ad metallum, feed chains here too, and the difference between a contractor's tunnel and a penal shaft can be measured in air. The ventilation shafts rise like periscopes. The ladders creak. A boy with a basket moves past you with the bounce of someone who has not yet learned to pace himself. Mainstream note, kept as level as your breath. Archaeology from Spanish mining districts, Dacian gold fields, and British sites shows systematic extraction, timbering, drainage, water lifting devices, stamped ingots with imperial names. Writers remark on the harshness. Lead poisoning leaves its signature in bones and sediments. Lamps and tools show standardized kit. Not every gallery is a hell. Many are simply long. But punishment gangs went to the worst and stayed until the lamp went out for them as well. You want air. You climb until sky returns and stumble into a sound like a prayer wheel, the heavy hush of a watermill. One mill, then another, then a hillside of them. Barbigal near Arlate, Alls, if you're lucky in your map, where 16 wheels once stepped water down a slope to grind grain for a city that loved bread. The mill's buckets bite, rise, spill. Hoppers whisper grain into stones that hum like a low choir. You stand in the flour dust until you look like a ghost who enjoys carbohydrates. Historians still argue whether complexes like Barbigal count as industrial revolution, in miniature, scaled, mechanized, market-facing, or as impressive exceptions in a largely muscle-powered economy. Either way, mills multiply tired hands, even animal-driven millstones in city bakeries, donkeys half asleep in blinders walking the world in circles, turn wheat into sleep with admirable dignity. You return to the estate at dusk and see the ergastulum from the outside, low barred, a house if houses had no windows. Some owners keep their crews there at night, others permit huts or shared rooms near the press house. The law peaks in rarely, custom decides more. A hard master locks first and asks later. A calculating one finds fines from peculium more efficient than stripes. You remember Section 3's house where fines replaced welts, and hope this field has learned the same tune. Rations arrive by habit. Grain measured with a fairness that tries to be mathematical. Salt, olives, a splash of oil. Once a week a bit of wine to tangle jokes together. Good stewards add vegetables as if they invented kindness. Bad ones pretend the books cannot count that high. The Vilica checks ears for infection, feet for blisters, and tempers for the kind of anger that will snap a tool tomorrow. Light joke too, she scolds a man for hoarding onions. He says he's saving tears for winter. She says winter will write its own onions. Contracts hum even here. Skilled hands sometimes lease themselves by the day to neighboring farms when the steward allows it. A mason in chains still sets stones straight enough to earn silent respect and a copper or two for his jar. Peculium grows in ditches and niches, a small garden patch by the barracks, a chicken kept like a secret, a share from an extra day at the mill if the overseer owes you a favor he'll never mention in daylight. Hope collects in jars and waits for the right festival. The estate's calendar binds people to seasons the way city calendars bind them to clients. Pruning, digging, grafting, harvest, press, vintage, each with songs, each with a risk that weather will translate labor into stories instead of yields. Columella advises prayers in the vineyard. He mostly means, check the drains, but he writes as if Jupiter reads agronomy. You watch a storm stall on a ridge and decide gods prefer the suspense of nearly rain. Punishment is the line you wish were thinner. Runaways wear iron collars stamped with a return address. Brands speak letters the skin cannot forget. Chains clink where laughter would sound better. Yet you also hear of estates that rarely use the rod because the steward discovered fear ruins vines. A man who can prune in March without sulking will carry your harvest in September without sabotage. The hard truth is that kindness here is often calculation with a human face. The soft truth is that sometimes calculation grows feelings when it isn't looking. Quirky tidbit. In some regions, presses doubled as party rooms after the first run of oil. The floor sanded, lamps hung, a flute recruited, and the estate allowed an hour where the crew danced on boards that had just crushed olives. It did nothing for yields and everything for stories that made next year survivable. By night you sit with the steward over a tablet that shows rows, yields, and a column labeled losses, which he taps with the sadness of a man who respects numbers even when they bite. Mice, mildew, a broken axle on the road to the port, a freedman contractor who promised sacks and delivered rumors. He shrugs and says a proverb about Jupiter and jars. You realize he is the domestic steward from Section 3 with dust on his sandals instead of cinnamon. And the same job, turn labor into ledger, ledger into life. Before you leave, you walk once more by the barracks where lamplight paints small ovals on faces. A man stitches a sandal. A woman braids a cord. Someone hums the end of the work song because endings help sleep arrive. You pass the mill and feel the last wheel shudder to a stop like a heart that learned to rest. Light joke 3. A boy asks the Vilica if mills sleep. She says mills dream of flour and wake up hungry. Mainstream anchor to close the gate. Literary sources: Cato, Varro, Columella, epigraphy, and archaeology document large estates with enslaved gangs, ergastula, seasonal rhythms, specialized roles, and managers. Mining districts and quarries trace imperial extraction with stamps and tools. Watermill complexes like Barbagal show scaled mechanization feeding urban bakeries. Historians still argue whether latifundia choked out smallholders everywhere or coexisted with tenant systems in the mosaic. The safest map shows both, shifting by region and century. The day, in any case, begins before dawn and ends when wheels sleep. You turn back toward the city, dust on your tongue tasting faintly of olives and iron, and carry the estate's metronome inside your chest. Tomorrow, urban workshops will trade fields-wide gestures for small, quick movements you can hear even in your dreams. Hammers on bronze, awls on leather, a shipwright's saw turning timber into rumor that a hull is almost ready. You wake to a different metronome, taps, scrapes, a saw pulling breath through timber, a loom whispering like grass in a steady wind. Urban workshops and trade fold the countryside's long gestures into small, precise movements. You step into an alley where signs hang like short stories: shoemaker's last, bronze lamp, painted amphora, and the street smells of leather, smoke, and the husk of ground grain from a bakery that has already made the morning possible. The day here begins with shutters lifted like eyelids. A cobbler's bench spills awls, lasts, and pride. He tests a strap the way a singer tests a scale. An enslaved apprentice, wiry, quick, attentive to silence, threads bore bristle through waxed linen, and draws a seam with a patience that would impress vines. The master grunts approval so softly it feels like a tip. "Remember," he murmurs, "shoes are maps of feet." The apprentice nods and glances at a little jar in the corner, his peculium, as if the coins inside purr when he works cleanly. Light joke 1. A customer declares that right and left shoes are a patrician conspiracy. The cobbler replies that even senators walk crooked without them. Farther along, bronze sings. A lampmaker pours molten metal into molds blackened smooth with use. The steam smells like old rain. A boy turns a crank for bellows, counting to keep rhythm. The caster hums back, and you realize music survives even where he pretends to dislike it. Finished lamps, some shaped like dolphins that never saw water, line a shelf. A tiny hinge lid winks as if it understands private moments. The overseer, enslaved, competent, soot-streaked, checks the fill lines on oil jugs and keeps ledgers that a banker would envy. He can price ancestresses and gossip with equal accuracy. Mainstream anchor, steady as an anvil. Cities ran on artisanal shops where enslaved and free labor mixed. Textile fullers and dyers, metalworkers, carpenters, potters, bakers, shipwrights, mosaicists. Collegia, associations of craftsmen and traders, offered funerals, feasts, mutual aid, and sometimes subtle lobbying. Inscriptions and graffiti advertised bakers' guilds, shipowners, bath attendants. Legal sources mention Collegia's rules and Rome's occasional suspicion when clubs look too much like politics with appetizers. Turn a corner and step into a fuller's workshop, where amphorae of urine, yes, and you are now very awake, feed vats that soften and clean wool. A slave stamps cloth with bare feet, steady and resigned. Another stirs with a paddle, humming the way one hums when the nose requests distraction. The foreman jokes that emperors tax everything that moves, including this. You smile because you know Vespasian's famous line about money and smell. Cloth emerges brighter than the day that sacrificed its dignity to clean it. The worker wrings a tunic with enviable wrist strength and says, not unkindly, "We do what keeps winter off people." The dignity returns on wearers whom the workshop will likely never meet. Upstairs, looms chatter. A woman, enslaved, not cowed, throws a shuttle and catches it in a choreography that could make a metronome weep with envy. Her daughter, freeborn by a matron's manumission last spring, ties heddles with a concentration that would shame senators late to speeches. They talk about dye lots as if dye were a cousin who misbehaves at festivals. This one runs. This one sulks. Threads cross, patience accumulates, and a bolt of cloth grows like a thought that refused to remain small. At the riverfront shipyard, the air tastes of resin and hope. Ribs rise from a keel like a whale remembering how to breathe. Oak strakes meet their fate under a shipwright's adze, which sculpts wood with syllables, tack, tack, hush. Enslaved carpenters work in teams. One measures, one holds, one cuts, one jokes so precisely it might as well be a clamp. A foreman marks frames with bits of charcoal and the quiet arrogance of a man who believes boats should float because numbers say so. Quirky tidbit, some yards set tiny terracotta charms, little hands, little phalluses, into the keel scarfs for luck, not because wood listens to superstition, but because men do. Trade arrives as choreography with paperwork. A warehouse clerk, enslaved but writing like a citizen of sentences, reads the titularly picty painted on amphory, origin, contents, weight, inspector's mark, and logs them with a stylus that moves faster than gossip. Gara Hispani for the cookshops, Bedekin oil for lamps and bread, Cretan wine for men who say they prefer Falernian but drink what their purse respects. The clerk knows which amphory lie when they claim to be first press. He also knows when to pretend not to notice. The dock is diplomacy. Historians still argue whether urban slavery concentrated mostly in big elite workshops or diffused among countless small shops with a few enslaved hands each. The archaeological city feels like a mosaic. Grand bakeries with donkey mills and chains of ovens next to family booths where one enslaved boy does the work of three and hums to keep time. The collegia knit the mosaic into networks, feasts, funerals, rules written in earnest Latin with spelling more honest than perfect. You spend late morning in a bakery where donkeys walk a patient circle, blindfolded like monks. Stones grind, flour lifts into air, an enslaved pister cuts dough with a wire and flips loaves onto peels. The oven's mouth glows like a red proverb. The master lets the crew keep a portion of bran for their families, panis mineribus for those who like their bread honest about its origins. A boy scorches his knuckles and laughs with the defiance that says, "It is worth it." The forewoman, freed last year, adjusts the schedule like a conductor who learned to count in heat. Light joke too, a customer says the loaf is too round. She replies, "We tried square but the corners were crunchy." Across the street, a mosaicist squints at a floor that will outlive everyone in the room. Tesserae, stone, glass, the occasional shell, sit in bowls that look like pallets arranged by someone who takes pleasure in order. A small team, two free, one freed, one enslaved, lays borders in black and white while the master tries a green so dark it might be a shadow. The enslaved boy fits a single triangle into a flick of dolphin tail with the reverence of someone stitching time. His jar of coins is heavier than yesterday. He pretends not to smile at that. Contracts hum in a back room where the shipping office smells of wax and impatience. A merchant dictates a singrapha, IOU, to an enslaved scribe with a hand so clean his letters look like he polished them. A shipowner signs a charter for a load of amphory to Puteoli. The notary reads back the parts that might turn into quarrels later. The scribe is quick with stipulation clauses that thicken paper into shield. Do you promise to deliver by the calends? I promise. The scribe could teach your Section 10 banker a thing or two about turning promises into cushions. Afternoon leans on the city. Shadows turn into shade. A glassblower cools a neck with a breath that looks like a prayer. A leather worker cuts patterns while an enslaved girl stamps rosettes onto straps. Her rhythm could steady a mill. A perfume seller, Greek, fast-talking, benevolent, offers a dab on your wrist as if the day needed a soft period. You accept and smell crushed roses hiding under something woodsy and patient. Trade is not only goods, it is moods and their containers. The law walks these alleys in work clothes. Masters sign leases with penalties for damp walls. Your Section 10 ceiling, now a running joke among landlords with better floors. Ediles fined for false weights. Collegia file charters with rules about dues. Manumissions occur quietly at shop altars when an anniversary doubles as a decision. An enslaved manager accepts a sealed basket of coins to buy cedar at the dock. He will account for each coin tonight. His peculium will keep one or two with the master's narrowed eye tolerance. Mainstream fact to nail to the doorframe. Many urban enslaved specialized and, through peculium and patronage, bought freedom, later appearing on inscriptions as Augustales Severi, patrons of small shrines, donors to guild feasts. Freedmen dominated certain trades. Their names anchor arches and fountains in towns proud of bread and oil more than marble. The city's upward ladders were narrow, but they existed, and nimble feet found them. Near dusk, a caravan of handcarts creaks toward the gate. Baskets of figs, bolts of cloth, a crate of lamps that wink as if amused to travel. A collegium officer, freedman with a chest like a counter, checks his list and his pride. He reminds a young porter that guild funerals are for dues-paying members, which is a kindness with a ledger attached. The porter nods. Tomorrow he will skip a cup of wine and pay the fee. Quirky tidbit. Some shops kept a friendly household raven trained to cry, "Buyer!" at the bell, either as a joke or a miracle or both. Another. A few barbers advertised, "No blood today," which was likely humor, possibly a promise, and certainly a warning to men who told stories with hand gestures while being shaved. Evening slides down walls that have learned to listen. The cobbler counts coins into the jar and adds one for luck. The fuller rinses vats with a piety born of survival. The baker banks his fire like a father tucking in a child. The shipwright runs his palm along a hull and pretends not to feel the part that needs another plane tomorrow. Historians still argue whether the city's enslaved artisans were primarily profit engines for elite owners or complex actors building networks that outlasted bondage. The documents show ledgers full of numbers and altars full of names. You believe both and keep walking. Light joke 3. A wine shop sign promises excellent Greek wine and tolerable conversation. An enslaved server laughs and whispers that the conversation improves after the second cup. He keeps a coin slipped to him by a regular and folds it into a cloth pouch with a care that would suit relics. You end the day on a threshold, always the best place to understand cities, watching shutters close and lamps bloom behind them. The countryside gave Rome its calories. The workshops give it its texture. In these rooms, enslaved hands carve, sew, smelt, stamp, stir, and sign. They memorize measures and faces. They collect small coins that eventually turn into paper, then seals, then a day without a master. Tomorrow, the city's public slaves will clear streets, copy archives, and open aqueduct gates so all this can happen on schedule. For tonight, listen to the last hammer decided has said enough, the donkeys settle like old monks, and the river accept a hull with a sigh that could almost be a blessing. You wake before the city and find the people who wake it for everyone else. They don't stand on platforms or sign ledgers for profit. They carry keys that fit doors the rest of Rome barely notices. The keys to streets, fountains, archives, theaters, and the long, humming bones of aqueducts. Public slaves, owned by the city or the state, collared by law but collared also to a schedule that prefers sunrise. You follow them as they unlock a day. First, the streets. A crew with brooms of twig and stubbornness moves down the paving stones like a tide that refuses to retreat. One man scatters sand on a patch where yesterday's mule left a philosophical opinion. Another scoops the opinion into a wicker basket with dignity that would suit a priest. A cart rattles behind, iron-bound wheels offering commentary. The supervisor, enslaved, civic, a professional of tidiness, keeps a tally on a wax tablet with a stylus that could double as a wand. He gestures at a clogged gutter. Two boys in tunics that were once ambitious kneel, lift the grate, and coax out a damp civilization of leaves. Light joke one, a child watching says, "Is the gutter alive?" The supervisor replies, "Only after festivals." You trail them to a fountain where a stone lion looks surprised at the eternity of water. A public fountain keeper tests flow with a hand, the way a baker tests dough, and nods. He knows the aqueduct's temper, how the aqua marcia sulks in drought, and the aqua claudia brags when it shouldn't. He listens not only for volume but for tone. He has learned that a cheerful splash at dawn can turn into a sulk by noon if a sluice upstream forgets its manners. He belongs to the city, but he belongs also to the physics of arches and gradient. If a main pipe stutters, he walks faster than senators run. You remember your sorely learned lesson about ceilings and damp walls, Section 10's future complaint already clearing its throat, and feel grateful for the hands that keep water where water should be. Mainstream anchor, neat as a curb. Inscriptions and legal texts attest to substantial numbers of public slaves, servi publici, owned by municipalities or by the Roman state, charged with maintaining streets, baths, aqueducts, temples, archives, and public buildings. Some served as clerks, ushers, executioners, or attendants in magistrates' offices. Many wore collars naming their public master and station. Some gained privileges, salaries, or a path to manumission through long service or a grateful city council. You turn into a basilica as doors unbolt with a sigh that sounds like old wood forgiving the night. Inside, an archive clerk, enslaved by the treasury, free in his handwriting, lays out tablets and codices so that magistrates won't look lost when law knocks. He warms wax over a lamp, rubs a tablet smooth with the heel of his palm, and copies yesterday's decisions into today's memory. He knows where the old boundary judgment is, where the record of a freedman's manumission lies, where the letter from the governor answering 3 questions with 2 sentences sleeps. He doesn't argue cases, but he decides how fast truth can be found. Quirky tidbit: some archives kept tiny terracotta seals stamped with a city emblem to lock bundles. The clerks nicknamed them pigeons, because they always came home to roost on the same shelf. At the magistrates' tribunal, a public usher chalks the docket on a board. Who sues whom, at what hour, in which tone. He practices the names so he won't embarrass anyone whose temper outruns vowels. He carries a rod that is more punctuation than threat and learns to place it on the edge of a table exactly so, a period at the end of an argument. He will shush the forum gently because he prefers to keep his hearing into old age. When a petitioner arrives breathless with papers tied like a belt, the usher takes the bundle with both hands and the exact amount of sympathy that says, "You did right to bring it. The rest is time." Down a side street, two public slaves lift the shutters of a bath like eyelids. They test furnace fires with a rake, feed wood in a rhythm that suits steam, knock ash from a hypocaust flue so heat remembers its job. Bath attendants, some enslaved, some freed, some free, well benches, lay towels, and pretend not to notice poetry when men recite it too loudly. The water that will soon be laughter started hours ago as work no one claps for. Light joke too, the furnace keeper says the baths are philosophical. They make men think. The attendant says they also make men forget they owe for last week's soap. On the hill, a public copyist sits near a temple portico, copying decrees to be posted where pigeons and citizens both can read. He writes in a clear hand a father could love and leaves margins generous enough for future corrections and less generous for graffiti. He will thread the tablet to a nail with a cord tied in a knot that says, "I have seen wind." He is an enslaved municipal fact that travels well. As long as someone writes the rules, the city remembers its promises. The aqueduct gatehouse is a small fortress of numbers. A gatekeeper measures flow with a staff etched in units only the guild of water understands. He opens a sluice to a mill downstream. You remember mills dreaming of flour. He narrows another to scold a bath that has been too merry. He logs distributions because water, like coin, asserts itself best on paper. Historians still argue whether water distribution in Rome was mostly technical craft managed by a small corps of experts, or a broader bureaucracy seasoned with politics and favors. The surviving water law and Frontinus' careful bragging suggest both. A technical spine with political muscles flexing at festivals. At the theater. Public slaves dress the building for a day that will ask for applause. One checks the vela, awning, rigging with the lamplighter's calm. One chalks seating letters on steps. One tests the trapdoor for a comedy that insists on falling through. Another lays a basket of masks where actors will pretend to discover them. They are stagehands to neighborhoods that measure seasons and plays. Their names don't appear on bills, but their timing decides whether a punchline lands before or after the pigeon that always chooses the wrong moment. Midday, you sit with a municipal accountant, enslaved to the city but master of his columns. He collects market stall fees with courtesy that outlives arithmetic, records fines for false weights with a hand that neither rushes nor trembles, and enters expenditures for lamps on the street where muggers prefer shadows. He speaks quietly of a small stipend some public slaves receive and the hope of manumission a good city grants after years of bell-ringing, door-keeping, ledger-keeping. He shows you a manumission entry with a date and a note. For faithful service at the fountains. It reads like a puddle catching sunlight. Public punishment lives in the same list you prefer to read quickly. A staff of the quaestors parasitii or other officials includes executioners and jailers, often enslaved to the state, who do work the law requires and society keeps at arm's length. Their task is shapes of iron and timing. Their pay is coin in isolation. Their names are often forgotten on purpose. The city uses them the way it uses drains, necessary, undescribed, blamed only when they fail. You record the fact because history must. You do not linger because sleep will need to arrive later without shadows. Mainstream aside, balanced like a scale, epigraphic records show public slaves manumitted formally by city councils, sometimes with a bronze tablet announcing freedom and a new civic role. Others remained enslaved but enjoyed peculium and quasi-salaries. Some rose to trusted clerical positions. A few became indispensable enough to be famous for knowing where the real index was hiding. Municipal life depended on them as steadily as on curule chairs and voting days. Afternoon, the archive clerk hunts for an old charter a town elder swears exists. On the left shelf behind the box that looks like a box. He finds it because he remembers the smell of the leather thong used to tie that bundle. Not all memory uses eyes. He carries the deed to a magistrate who will resolve a boundary quarrel. You hear Section 9's surveyors clearing their throats, and watches the city avert a year of sulking in 3 paragraphs. He returns the charter to its left shelf, and because he is kind, moves the misleading box to the right. Quirky tidbit. Some city offices kept a bell shaped like a fish to summon water officials. Others kept a wooden hand to signal silence in hearings. Elsewhere a bronze pig sat on the fines table. A joke about money that squeals when squeezed. Public slaves learn which bell means bring the keys, and which means bring the book with the blue cord, and which means bring patience. Evening walks in on sandals that don't brag. A lamplighter, municipal, methodical, touches flame to wick along a street where shop signs yawn after a long day. He carries a pole with a hook and a small ladder strapped like a spare rib. Someone has chalked a rough proverb on a wall. Lamps don't argue, they light. He nods, because it's true and because the proverb doesn't have to carry a ladder. Light joke 3. A boy asks if he can help. The lamplighter says, "You can hold the ladder by telling it not to wobble." The boy whispers to the ladder and it behaves, as ladders sometimes do when believed in. Historians still argue whether public slavery softened the edge of bondage, civic identity, modest pay, paths to freedom, or merely relocated it from houses to halls. The ledger shows manumissions and collars, small stipends and big responsibilities, pride and dependence braided into one shift. Perhaps the fairest sentence is that the city's most public functions sat in hands that were not their own, and those hands made a day that felt owned by everyone else. Night takes the docket off the board. The usher washes chalk from his fingers. The fountain, still surprised, keeps being generous. You think of all the rooms you visited, the archive, the gatehouse, the theater, the baths, and realize how many keys you do not see until they stop turning. The city sleeps because public slaves have one more chore, to be unnoticed again by morning. You promised the lamplighter silently that you noticed him anyway. You sit with a magistrate's clerk while he warms a tablet over the lamp and reminds you that Rome's law can talk out of both sides of its mouth. On one side, an enslaved person is a res, a thing in someone's estate, transferable with a clause, appraisable like a meal. On the other side, the same person can swear oaths, learn, suffer, make contracts through a peculium, marry in everything but civil ceremony, and be the entire spine of a household. You hold both truths at once because the law does, and you will need both to understand how Rome draws lines around power and paints a few guardrails on them. Start with what owners can do, because powers are the walls you notice first. A master commands labor, disciplines, sells, and within wide bounds, disposes. The peculium an enslaved person holds is only a pouch tied to the master's belt in law. However, often the pouch hides under a mattress. If the slave injures a neighbor's vines, actions run against the master. He can pay damages or surrender the wrongdoer, noxi dedicio, in a ritual that survives like an old joke nobody laughs at. If the neighbor injures your slave, breaks an arm, kills a cook, the lex aquilia makes him pay the highest value within the statutory window, because even a city that itemizes people recognizes that loss is, among other things, arithmetic. Then the limits. They arrive as edicts, rescripts, and custom that grows teeth. Mainstream peg. By the early empire, the lex patronia, under Tiberius, restricts a master from throwing a slave to the beasts without a magistrate's permission. Hadrian and Antoninus Pius issue rulings that punish killing a slave sine causa and allow magistrates to hear complaints of extreme cruelty. Slaves appealing at a statue of the emperor or at a magistrate's threshold. Claudius measures, as the tradition tells it, free slaves whom masters abandon when seriously ill and punish masters who kill them to avoid expense. You can hear a principal whisper through the edicts. Property is not a license to make the city uglier than it already is. You watch a hearing where a collar-boned boy, shaking but steady, reports beatings. Beyond the custom of farms. The magistrate narrows his eyes, summons the master, and quotes an imperial rescript like someone reading a recipe that forbids too much salt. The outcome is not a revolution, it is a warning with consequences, a fine, an order, the boy transferred to a less theatrical house. It is thin mercy, but it exists, and in a legal climate that once bragged of vitae nocisk, life and death power, for fathers, thin mercy is weather-changing. Historians still argue whether these protections were common lifesavers or rare umbrellas. Did slaves frequently reach officials and win? Or are the texts the empire's self-congratulation pinned to a small number of cases? Papyri and inscriptions show petitions that worked. Satire shows cruelty that laughed at rules. The safest sentence says access varied by place, patronage, and luck, which is also how many cities still work. Punishments march beside protections like dissonant flutes. Runaways wear iron collars stamped with return addresses, sometimes with rewards promised in grammar that looks tired. Team me, quia fugio. Hold me, for I flee. Harboring fugitives draws penalties. Fugitivarii, catchers, deal in misery and coin. Household murders trigger the brutal senatus consultum silenianum. If a master dies by violence, and the household cannot supply a murderer, the entire enslaved household may face torture or worse, an old, ferocious policy meant to force vigilance that instead writes collective fear. Even so, later emperors clip its edges. Jurisdictions hesitate. The rule remains a thunderhead that sometimes passes without rain. Inside shops and counting rooms, law becomes scaffolding rather than hammer. The master's liability for his slaves' contracts depends on the doorway. Actio quod iusu reaches him if he ordered the deal. Actio instatoria and exercitoria reach him if he appoints a shopman or shipmaster. Actio de peculio and de in rem verso skim from the slave's peculium and from benefits the master actually pocketed. You feel the practical fairness. Creditors get paid to the extent the household truly grew richer. Masters are not bankrupted for every side bet a clever boy makes in the alley. Light joke 1. A creditor complains that the peculium is very small today. The steward replies that hope compounds interest better than coin. Criminal procedure reveals the empire's least flattering silhouette. The enslaved are often examined under torture, especially when testifying against freeborn. Jurists qualify. No torture for trifles, proportional pain, as if proportionality could make such things polite, credibility not presumed from screams. Governors write reasons that try to sound clean despite stains. You hold the fact without ornament because sleep will need to visit you later. The city that posts rules about weights and dowries also keeps cords in a drawer with a label that reads, "Evidence." Against this, carve out the small sanctuaries that practice invents. Appeals for sanctuary at imperial statues. Temple doors that magistrates respect long enough to hear. Patrons who stand between wrath and a person whose only refuge is someone else's reputation. A neighbor who insists aloud, loud is key, that the law has limits. The line between mercy and theater remains thin. You take both when offered. Manumission law sits at the edge of this section, because freedom is the sharpest protection of all. But even freedom comes with laws that fence it. Lex Aelia Sentia and Lex Fuefia Caninia, Augustan age. Limit manumission by age and by number. No mass emancipations on a whim. No freeing a child who will then drown without a patron's boat. Freedmen owe obsequium, respect, and opere, agreed services, to their patrons. Patrons owe protection. Courts referee when gratitude turns into extortion in either direction. You will walk the full path to freedom in Section 9. For now, note that Rome encourages manumission while managing it like a careful host. Ownership's edges are policed with familiar tools. A buyer who discovers that a newly purchased slave has epilepsy or a habit of running finds the Edilician edict ready. Actio redhibitoria to return the sale, actio quanti minores to reduce the price. A seller who boasts beyond truth earns a courtroom education in adjectives. A lender who rents out chained labor without disclosing those chains may meet a magistrate who dislikes surprises. Light joke 2. A dealer swears a boy is quiet. In court, witnesses translate that as asleep only after midnight. Religion hums beneath the statutes. Manumissions by will in temples, at altars, before friends who will remember, insurers of conscience as well as of title. Some households mark a manumission day with wreaths as if a small festival joined the calendar. Others treat freedom like a ledger entry, stamped and filed with no laurel visible. Either way, city walls slowly fill with names of the newly free, and on many stones those names sit above the titles of offices and collegia, proof that a path exists even when it scrapes knees. Quirky tidbit: a handful of slave collars found by archaeologists carry not just names and addresses but little jokes or pleas. Don't detain me. I belong to the bakery by the big fig tree. Which means even metal wanted a voice. Another shows a tiny copper hand riveted on for luck. You decide it worked because someone kept it. Owners who kill with naked cruelty are no longer invisible to law by your century's standards. Antoninus Pius stance: punish without cause killing, prosecute savage treatment, transfer victims to kinder hands, sits on tablets and in governors' minds. Hadrian forbids gladiatorial consignments without official order. It is not equality. It is not even safety guaranteed. It is the state saying, "Not like that," and sometimes meaning it loudly enough that neighbors hear and adjust. Historians still argue whether Roman law's small mercies were sincere steps toward humanization or reputational threadwork woven over hardwood. Some see a steady arc, Petronia to Antoninus to later Christian emperors, each clipping teeth from the old wolf. Others see public relations, rules that declare decency while leaving private cruelty thick behind doors. Documents support both parables. Your nose, after weeks in kitchens and fields, says practice leaned on the character of stewards, patrons, and cities, with law as a usable stick when decent people needed one. Light joke 3. Because even law sleeps better after a smile. A jurist tells a student that a slave is a talking tool. The student replies that some tools talk better than jurists. The jurist assigns him 3 more pages of Ulpian and calls it justice. You close the tablet with the clerk and feel how much of Roman protection is procedural. Someone to hear, something to cite, somewhere to stand. That is not the courtyard where the lash is stored. Status remains unequal by design, yet within the inequalities, rules grow like herbs in cracks, small, fragrant, sometimes strong enough to flavor a day. Tomorrow you will trace punishments and control, brands, chains, prisons, and the machinery of fear, because the same city that limited a master's hand also forged the iron that hand could hold. For tonight, keep the small sentence the law taught you, not absolute, not kind enough, but not nothing. You follow the sound of iron being thoughtful, not crashing, just touching, into a courtyard where punishment prepares itself like a ritual that would love to be unnecessary. Rome keeps a toolbox for fear, collars, brands, chains, stocks, cells, and the long shadow of examples made in public. The law does not write poetry about these things, but it catalogues them with a patience that feels like weather. You stand to the side and let the list assemble around you, then you sort it the way a clerk would, by purpose, by theater, by what it hopes to prevent. First, flight. Collars of iron declare identity like grim necklaces, plates stamped. Hold me, for I flee, return me to name, workshop, district, a promise of reward that tries to make empathy do paperwork. Some bear little brass hands riveted for luck, others carry a barked address that has never learned please. Runaways meet a market of fugitive arii, catchers who know the smell of fear and the routes through vineyards. Harborers risk penalties that begin at fines and can climb to something that makes neighbors speak softly for a week. Mainstream peg to steady the page, the senatus consultum silenianum, first C. Famously mandates investigations, often torture, of an entire enslaved household when a master is murdered and the killer is unknown, with collective punishment possible. Over time, jurists and emperors trim its edges, but the threat remains a building you can see from anywhere in the city. Then discipline. The rod and the lash live in corners like tools that everyone pretends are unpopular. Some houses find peculium for minor offenses because arithmetic hurts cleaner. Others stage pain to teach other eyes. Overseers on estates carry chains that clink a lesson. City workshops prefer public rebuke with a hand on a shoulder and a line on a tablet that says, "Dock 1 day's pay," in a language that never names pay. You note the grammar, moderate, customary, within reason. The law repeats these words like a spell, and sometimes the spell works. Confinement is punishment that masquerades as waiting. The ergastulum on estates, low barred, armed with boredom, holds crews at night when fear outweighs trust. In cities, small cells lurk behind workshops for those who drink courage at noon and regret it by dusk. Chains fix ankles to benches for hours that feel like winter. The magistrate distinguishes between house discipline and public offense, and the line is often a door. A lash inside belongs to the master. A lash outside belongs to the city. Light joke 1. A steward says he prefers quiet punishments. A scribe asks whether silence counts as a penalty. The steward replies, For some, yes. Branding writes history on skin. Letters like F, fugitivus, declare a past the wearer may have outgrown. A heated iron presses a rumor into permanence. Later jurists and emperors discourage casual branding. Antoninus Pius' weather of mercy reaches even here. Kill without cause, be punished. Mark without need, be judged. But practice lags where tempers run faster than edicts. You follow the discomfort where it belongs, between rule and habit, between intention and afternoon. Public theater polices more than bodies. It polices imaginations. Crucifixion, fastened on roads or hills, slow, performative, sends a message written in hours. Damnatio ad bestias turns fear into entertainment, and entertainment into policy. These are not everyday punishments. They are announcements, and the city reserves them for crimes that scare magistrates enough to perform bravery. Historians still argue whether gladiatorial consignments under private anger were truly common or mainly polemical specters. Hadrian and others forbade consigning slaves to the arena without magistrate approval. But stories run faster than statutes. Inside shops, control prefers ink. Chains and brands are clumsy where contracts and ledgers can bite. An enslaved manager who misdirects goods meets the actio furti, theft, with stiff multiples. A borrower who rents a tool for a side job without permission meets furtum usus, theft by use, and a lecture with teeth. Masters who deny promised rations face unrest that looks like a work slowdown and feels like a lawsuit no one has time to file. The clever house corrects with schedules and shares. Finish this, keep that, because consent, even borrowed, often works better than iron. Informers add a nervous instrument to the orchestra. Rome pays in coin in consideration for tips that keep fires small. A port official thanks the boy who notes the nighttime loading of suspicious amphorae. A clerk whispers where the hidden peculium jar funds a gambling ring that turns afternoons loud. Informing breeds mistrust. Mistrust breeds caution. Caution keeps ledgers neat. You dislike this but admit its effectiveness, as one admits vinegar's value after the salad is eaten. Torture sits in procedure like a locked drawer, open for capital cases, for testimony against certain statuses, for conspiracies where magistrates fear to be surprised. Jurists insist on proportion, on reasons written, on not believing screams mechanically. They fail as often as they succeed. They succeed often enough that judges learn to say no without being punished for hesitating. You place this instrument far from sleep and agree to remember it without summarizing it as wisdom. On estates, nighttime patrols and day marks substitute for brick. Overseers cut notches in staffs for rows done, and weigh baskets that should weigh the same. A singer in the fields keeps tempo so individuals cannot wander into dreams. A steward's wife, the vilica, enforces small courtesies. Wash the bowl, fold the cloak, return the pruning hook, because small untidiness grows big before harvest. Light joke too, she tells a worker not to borrow time from tomorrow. He asks the rate. She replies, usurious. Religious spaces become safety valves. Enslaved persons appeal at statues of the emperor or in temples, asking transfer to kindermasters, alleging cruelty beyond custom. Governors and magistrates listen enough times that the story spreads. There is a place to stand, there is a threshold that changes the tone of voices behind you. It does not always work. It works just enough that hard masters adjust to the possibility of embarrassment. Punishments for harborers circle back to community. A neighbor who shelters a runaway for a night out of pity faces fines if he hides the person from lawful claim. A neighbor who shelters to extract work or sex faces worse. Law knows the difference when it wants to. Cities know it even when the law squints. You hear of poor huts that risk the fine anyway because heart outruns arithmetic. You hear of rich houses that pay the fine as a cost of securing a clever cook, then learn that clever cooks tend to keep running. Control also arrives as counting kindnesses because fear alone is expensive. Rations on schedule. A little wine when the press runs late. Allowed markets on festival days where enslaved can sell herbs or woven cords and feed the peculium jar. Small stipends for public slaves that behave like wages without declaring revolution. Manumission promised at a child's naming day and actually delivered 20 years later with a wreath and a handshake that shakes for real. These are policies as much as they are mercies. They work better than collars at making tomorrow possible. Quirky tidbit. Some iron collars recovered bear the name of the artisan who forged them alongside the masters. Made by Felix the Smith. Return me to. As if even punishment required a signature. Another shows a pierced tab where a little bell once hung. A walking sound, an audible address. A humiliation that also served as location device long before maps learned to sing. The empire's reforms push and pull. The Lex Petronia restricts bestial consignments. Hadrian scolds cruelty. Antoninus Pius forbids killing without cause and frames the enslaved person's complaint as something a magistrate may hear. Later Christian emperors add rhetoric about mercy and piety, tweak penalties, and increase manumission's glow. Historians still argue whether the Christian turn softened the system in daily life or mostly gave new reasons for old decencies. The documentary Weather shows both showers and droughts. Revolt is the far horizon of control, a fear that colors everyday choices. Households whispered the Sicilian uprisings. Overseers mutter the name Spartacus like a superstition. Locks grow thicker when rumor says a new man in the barracks tells good stories at night. After each revolt, Rome tightens rules, limits gatherings, polices weapons, watches markets that sell more iron than stew. But the daily tools of control remain mostly small: collars, fines, schedules, examples, and the steady offer of manumission to those who turn their fear into savings. Light joke 3, tired but gentler than chains, a jurist says the best control is clear rules posted where all can read. A steward replies, "Then teach my master to read his own lists." The clerk laughs into his sleeve and writes one more copy anyway. You leave the courtyard where iron thinks about itself and step into a street where life rehearses normal. A collar glints, a schedule chimes, a ladle pours, a lamplighter carries flame like a polite sermon. The law's apparatus of punishment and control is everywhere and nowhere, felt in choices, seen in hardware, softened by custom, sharpened by fear. Your ledger for the day lists a mainstream fact, the SC Selenium and its long shadow, a quirky artifact, bell-collared iron with a smith's signature, and a debate that refuses to resolve itself. Were reforms mercy or marketing? Tomorrow the door to freedom opens, not for everyone, not quickly, but with a creak that becomes a corridor. For tonight you sleep with the small relief that rules sometimes say, enough, and that a city can learn, haltingly, to prefer fines to scars. You stand in a courtyard where sunlight makes dust look like a blessing and realize that freedom, in Rome, often begins with paperwork you can hear. Oaths, taps of a stylus, the puff of breath that lifts a seal's ribbon. Manumission is not a feeling. It is a ritual that turns feeling into law. You have watched collars fasten, now you watch a cord untie, and you keep your voice low because the room is practicing relief. First path. The old stage play, Manumission Vindicta. A magistrate sits, a lictor holds a rod, the vindicta, and a friend of the enslaved person steps forward to claim. I say this person is free. The touch of the rod is light, ceremonial, like a doorbell for the law. The master does not contradict. The magistrate pronounces. The clerk scratches the moment into wax. And a person who walked in as property walks out as a citizen, or at least as someone who now belongs to himself. You feel the air shift when the formula ends. Light joke 1. The lictor calls the rod. My most persuasive argument. The clerk replies. Mine is a cleaner handwriting. Second path. Manumission Tsunsu. In older days, rarer by your era but not forgotten, the master has a name placed on the citizen roll at a census. The state counts the person free the way it counts fields and mules, and the counting is liberation. It is a bureaucrat's freedom, tidy, seasonal, and almost pastoral. You picture a scribe writing a new name between two old ones and smiling as if planting. Third path. Manumission Testamento. Death, that excellent organizer, frees with ink. A master declares in his will, let so-and-so be free, or appoints a friend to free many by delegated grace. On the day the will is read, names bloom like lamps. Lucia, free. Zeno, free. Primogenia, free. With conditions, with gifts, with opre, services, due to the heirs, with a note about the bakery they must keep running because the neighborhood is sentimental about bread. Mainstream anchor to set on a clean shelf, Augustan reforms. Lex Fufia Caninia and Lex Aelia Sentia. Limit wholesale manumissions and wills, caps by fractions, and set minimum ages for masters and slaves, trying to keep citizens meaningful and manumission measured. The effect is to funnel freedom through deliberate doors, not bursts. Between those pillars, daily practice braids smaller cords. Inter amicos, a declaration, among friends, becomes a recognized path. The master announces freedom before witnesses. The city respects witnesses when they are respectable. Per epistolum, by letter, carries weight when accompanied by continued treatment as free. Manumission, by the table, at a dinner, by temple offerings at a shrine, by a handshake that is remembered by people whose memory counts. These softer rites gain hardness when the freed person lives as free and no one withstanding says otherwise. Rome is conservative about beginnings, liberal about continuities. Money hums under everything, peculium. That jar you saw in kitchens and workshops has been filling for years. Fees for copying letters, coins for extra loads carried, a chicken sold, herbs tied in bunches and traded for copper. When a number finally equals an unspoken price, the enslaved person offers to buy his own freedom. The master accepts, sometimes with theatrical reluctance, sometimes with matching joy, and the purchase money technically circles through the master's hand, since peculium is in law his, before returning as a manumission fee. Everyone pretends the circle is straight. The law, mercifully, agrees. Light joke 2. The steward counts the coins twice. The freedman says, I counted them every night for 10 years. They are loyal. You learn the grammar of opre, freedman's services owed to patrons. A secretary, newly free, promises a set number of days each year copying letters. A cook agrees to provide a feast on certain festivals. A porter commits to 3 market days' labor each month until the patron's son finishes wasting money on racing teams and grows manageable. Courts enforce these obligations when patrons and freed step on each other's toes. Courts also scold patrons who mistake obsequium, respect, for ownership refurbished. The best relationships feel like long friendships with rules. The worst feel like sharpened leashes. Historians still argue whether Opre protected patrons from sudden abandonment or prolonged dependence past decency. Contracts suggest both. Epitaphs sometimes answer. He was dear to his patron and to himself. Not every manumission makes a full citizen at a stroke. Status after freedom depends on the master's status, the form used, and the law's calendar. A slave freed by a citizen in proper form becomes a Roman citizen, often with the nomen of the patron stamped in front like a proud prefix. One freed informally might be Latinus Iunianus, a legal halfway house, freed but not fully enfranchised, able to trade and marry Latin style, able to gain citizenship later by certain acts, owning and manumitting a slave by formal right, or petitioning under friendly emperors who like civic math. Freed by a peregrine, you might join his city's story instead. Mainstream fact, to pin here, the Lex Iunia Urbana, early 1st C, recognized informally freed slaves as Latini Uniani, while other measures and imperial rescripts provided various ladders to full citizenship. Justinian later swept many half-statuses away, preferring cleaner categories. Bureaucracy discovered kindness when it discovered simplicity. Quirky tidbit: some manumission records show tiny sketches, little wreaths or clasped hands, in the margin, as if a clerk couldn't help decorating his favorite kind of entry. Another, a few freedmen celebrated manumission anniversaries like birthdays, inviting former shopmates to a dinner where the first toast was to the lictor's rod, which everyone agreed was an odd but effective guest. Women moved through these doors too, and their paths carried different luggage. A nutrix, nurse, freed after decades might receive a small annuity and rooms near the house she kept steady. An ornatrix freed to marry a client's cousin brings skill as dowry. A concubine freed and then married legitimates the children standing anxiously nearby, who exhale audibly when the seal presses. Free women owe obsequium as freedmen do. Their opre may be domestic expertise measured in feast days rather than a tally of court appearances. A successful freedwoman may run a shop under her own name with a sign that refuses to apologize. The city is full of marks where manumission landed softly. Guilds, collegia, elect freedmen and freedwomen as officers. Inscriptions brag Augustilis, severe Augustilis. Ritual rolls often filled by wealthy freedmen who bought honor with benefactions, fountains, paving stones, banquets where poor citizens ate like senators and told stories that sounded more Roman than Romans. Tombs bloom with names that pair a patron's nomen and a freedman's chosen cognomen into a new identity that says both thanks and independence. You read L. Velugia Successus, and hear both a house and a person speaking. Not every freedom is perfect. Some patrons cling too tightly. Some free people vanish too quickly. Some opre lists look like punishments disguised as gratitude. Courts moderate. A freedman may be excused from services when age or distance makes promises cruel. A patron may demand respect when insult rings louder than independence. The law, for once, behaves like an adult. You sit in a temple portico and watch a small manumission done as prayer. The master lays a coin on the altar, the soon-to-be-freed lays a wreath. A priest murmurs what you suspect is mostly public relations, and witnesses nod with the solemn joy of people who like being useful. The freedman touches the doorpost on the way out, as if ensuring the world is solid. You think of the ergasculum's barred door, and decide the gesture is fitting. Check the door both ways. Light joke 3. The newly freed man says he must learn to walk differently. His friend says freedom is not new shoes. He replies, maybe, but the road looks wider. Manumission also travels outward through families. A mother freed by will frees a son with her peculium. A freedman who prospers buys his wife's freedom and then his brother's. A patron sponsors a talented boy for citizenship because talent persuades where petitions waste shoes. In a decade, an alley's population map changes. More freeborn babies, more signet rings with initials, more arguments about whether the guild feast needs better musicians this year. Freedom scales not only by individuals but by neighborhoods. Historians still argue whether Rome's high rate of manumission made slavery less harsh or simply more efficient. Did the promise of freedom oil the machine, or did it corrosively humanize it? Numbers from epitaphs and records say manumission was common enough to be a social fact. Minds say cruelty did not retire. Perhaps the answer is that a door matters even when the corridor beyond is crowded. As dusk composes itself, you walk past a shop where a freedman notary seals a tablet for a client who still calls him by the old house name when he forgets. The notary does not correct him. The seal will. You pass a bakery where a freed forewoman counts loaves and laughter. A fountain where a public slave, nearly free after 20 years, stares a moment at the water as if practicing his first day without keys. You think of rods that touched lightly, jars that filled slowly, witnesses who remembered on purpose, laws that preferred schedule to whim. The city gives many kinds of days. Today it gave you a good one. You sleep with a list again. Vindicta, census, will, among friends, by letter, temple. Peculium counted. Opre negotiated. Half statuses climbed. Women freed and freeing. Guilds adopting. Patrons learning proportion. Courts intervening when affection and obligation tangle. Tomorrow you will walk into the afterlives of freedom, patronage ties, civic rights, ceilings you can see, ladders you can climb, and listen to how former collars ring in memory like bells you eventually stop hearing except in dreams. Morning finds you at a threshold again, because freedom in Rome is mostly thresholds, and the first thing you learn is how many doors open with the same key. As a freed person, you step out carrying 3 invisible items: a patron's name stitched to your own, a bundle of rights folded like a travel cloak, and a ceiling you can see even in good weather. You walk anyway, because streets are made for it, and today you will test how far the city lets you go before someone reminds you where the plaster ends. Start with the name. The day you were freed, you took your patron's nomen as a front porch and kept or chose a cognomen as your living room. L. Villagio successus. A. Petronia nice. You sign it on tablets with a small tremor the first week, then with the calm of someone who recognizes his own handwriting. That name is currency. You can open accounts, witness contracts, join a collegium, swear oaths that stick to walls. It is also a calling card. People see the nomen and picture the patron, which helps when the baker doubts your change and hurts when the patron has quarreled with half the Aventine. Light joke 1. You tell a clerk your new name. He says, "Congratulations on the promotion," to 3 words. Rights arrive as a basket with useful tools. You can marry with Roman connubium. If your spouse has it, make a will, sue and be sued, Own and sell, join a guild, and sit in assemblies if your city still bothers to count hands. You cannot hold the high magistracies that boss lictors around, and you will rarely join the Senate except as a whispered example of not the usual sort. In many towns, though, the doors that matter for daily life open wide. You become Augustulis or severe Augustulis, one of those ritual officials who keep the imperial cult tidy and the calendar festive, offices proudly filled by freedmen with purses fat from work and a taste for public generosity. Mainstream peg, steady as a milestone. Inscriptions across Italy and the western provinces show freedmen frequently serving as severi Augustales, or similar cult officials, funding banquets, paving streets, building fountains, and receiving public honor. They appear as guild officers, donors to temples, patrons of neighborhoods. Their names cover stone the way bread covers tables, thickly, proudly, daily. Work, of course, continues, but now the ledger is yours. Many freedmen remain where their skill matured. The secretary opens a notary stall. The cook runs a popina with stews that taste like patience. The shipyard foreman takes contracts for small hulls. The dispensator becomes a banker whose smile is collateral. Others turn to trade they learned by watching: oil import, wine distribution, bricks with stamps that read like family trees. You feel your peculium jar outgrow its ceramic and move into a money box, then a chest, then a partner's handshake. The patron may invest. The patron may merely nod. Either way, you send a small basket on your manumission anniversary. The old kitchen's olives and a note that says more than it writes. Patronage remains a tether, and not always gentle. Obsequium, respect, means you don't haul your patron into court without permission, and you don't insult him in public unless you are rehearsing poverty. Opre, services, mean you copy letters on certain days, cater a feast when the household wants to remember the dead, or show up to carry dignity where dignity has forgotten its sandals. Courts listen when either of you overplays the hand. A patron who treats a freedman like a slave and drag earns a judge's raised eyebrow and a trimmed list of services. A freedman who forgets that gratitude exists learns that judges have long memories for short courtesies. Light joke too, your patron says. Jump, you ask? How often this year? With a smile and a pocket calendar. Social ceilings declare themselves with delicate furniture. You recline at dinner in your own house but still sit upright in some others. You wear a ring with a signet but not a certain gemstone that whispers, "Born rich." You place your freed status on your tomb proudly and still watch a freeborn neighbor squint at it like handwriting he can't read. Marrying up is possible but complicated. Marrying across, to another freed person or respectable artisan, feels like walking downhill with a basket you know how to balance. Your freeborn children, though, ingenui, wake under a higher ceiling and sometimes forget there ever was one. You do not remind them often. The city will do that enough. Guild life, collegia, becomes your parliament. The baker's hall smells of flour and self-importance. The shipowner's hall smells of tar and anecdotes. The fuller's hall smells like industry and defiance. You pay dues, vote on funeral funds, argue about whether this year's feast should include better musicians or more wine. The correct answer is both, and occasionally lobby the ediles about street repairs near your shops. The guild gives you a voice the city recognizes because the guild provides services the city forgets to plan until it is thirsty. Quirky tidbit. Some freedmen had mock triumphs inside collegia after a big donation, parading on a rented litter with laurel, a toy Jupiter, and a banner that read something like, "He paved the street by the olive cellar." Half joke, half-love letter from a neighborhood that knew exactly who paid for fewer puddles. You learn to navigate invitations. Freeborn aristocrats, with mixed sincerity, court your money for their projects. Poets court your dinners for their stomachs. Magistrates court your calm when riots look fashionable. You support what you can, decline what you must, and keep a small fund for emergencies that smell like opportunity wearing a disguise. You also build a little shrine in the shop, Laura's with fresh garlands, a tiny bronze of Mercury with his sly smile, to remind your day that luck visits where it is invited and accounts for where it has been. The law shadows you with protections and reminders. Your patron cannot seize your property at whim. He cannot sell your children into anything but a lecture. He cannot demand more opre than agreed without a judge who enjoys saying no. You, in turn, cannot sue him for slander because reputations knit slowly. You cannot deny obsequium without earning looks in markets where grapes are judged by the company they keep. Historians still argue whether the patron, freedman tie was more often a ladder or a leash. Was it mutualism with obligations, or asymmetry wearing politeness? Epitaphs favor ladders, comedies favor leashes. Your calendar says both, alternating by week. Money gives you different manners. You endow a fountain with a Latin couplet borrowed from a friend who keeps a library. You fund a bench along the street where your shop's customers like to rest. You give small dowries for orphan girls from your guild because someone once measured your onions kindly, and you remember. The town council thanks you with a seat in the front row at festivals and a crown on festival days that hurts your ears but pleases your mother. Family shifts with relief. If you were partnered in bondage, you legalize it now. If children came before law, you legitimate them with a nod and a magistrate's patience. If your mother still works in someone else's kitchen, you save until her manumission day tastes like bread and evening. You hang the old collar behind a curtain, no dramatic gestures, just a quiet promise to never need it again. A neighbor asks why you keep it. You say it is a weight that remembers you. Light joke 3. Your son tries it on as a joke. You tell him it doesn't match his tunic. He never tries again. Public honor arrives in increments you can count. Today, a seat on a board that inspects weights and measures. Tomorrow, a statue base that says, "For his generosity," and if you're lucky, and his good humor. You will never be consul, and that is fine because consuls do not sleep. You will, however, be the reason a street is less muddy and a widow feels less alone on market day. That is a republic a person can hold in his hands. Mainstream detail to fold carefully. Freedmen could not hold the cursus honorum of senatorial offices, and many magistracies remained closed. Yet municipal councils honored wealthy freedmen with local titles, and the imperial household elevated freedmen to powerful posts, a rationibus, a libellus, a bipistulus, roles that made the machinery of empire purr. Even in cities far from the Palatine, freedmen's names crowd donor lists and guild rolls, evidence that freedom did not mean quiet. Memory complicates prosperity. Some freeborn never forget your collar even when you do. Some freedmen never forget it even when others do. You learn to carry pride lightly, gratitude steadily, and the past like a coin in the pocket, present, weighty, not constantly displayed. When you pass the market where you once stood with a placard listing your virtues like a price, you glance only once and then concentrate on the olives because they're good this year, and your dinner guests will notice. Historians still argue whether the next generation erased the stain entirely. Were freedmen's ingenuous children truly absorbed into freeborn society? Or did polite registers keep a ghostly asterisk? The stones say children became magistrates in some towns. The jokes say nobody forgets. The safest truth is that time and coins sand edges faster than pronouncements do. Near dusk, you join the august Alash for a small procession. Lamps, laurel, oaths you mumble pleasantly. You catch your reflection in a shop window. Good tunic, new ring, posture that doesn't apologize. A boy watching asks if you are important. You say, only when I remember to be kind. And he shrugs like someone who will test your thesis. You leave a coin at the fountain for the public slave who kept it clean in section 6. He nods as if accepting a secret only you two know. You end the day writing your will with the notary who once copied for your patron. You leave money for the collegium feast, musicians and wine, for your mother's shrine, for the boy in your shop who ties bundles neatly and pretends not to. You free an older worker in your kitchen by testament because someone freed you by testament, and recipes deserve continuity. When the seal is pressed, you breathe the way you did at manumission, once deeply, like a door opening again. By night, the ceiling is still there, but so are the lamps you bought to make it look higher. You sleep hearing guild laughter, the fountain's calm, and a patron's voice that has become less command and more invitation. Tomorrow, you'll visit the edges of these freedoms, sex, family, and the tangles of status that households cannot stop inventing, and you'll remember to bring the ring, the wreath, and the patience that keeps rights from becoming arguments. You wake to the soft sounds a house makes before anyone admits to being awake. A cradle's tiny hinge, water poured into a shallow bowl, a whisper that might be a prayer or just a mother planning the day. Family in Rome is architecture made of people, and when bondage runs through it the blueprints get complicated. You walk the corridors gently, because here love, law, and logistics bump shoulders more often than they bow. Start with the simplest sentence that refuses to stay simple. The child follows the mother. Partus sequitur ventrem. If the mother is enslaved at the moment of birth, the child is enslaved. If she is free, the child is free. Fathers, poets, patrons, or passers-by matter less to status than the uterus the city counts. Mainstream fact to anchor the room. Jurists from Gaius onward state the rule explicitly, and practice treats it as administrative arithmetic. Emancipation of the mother later does not retroactively free earlier born children, though patrons sometimes manumit them together out of policy, sentiment, or both. You feel the gravity of that timing in the way a midwife looks at a calendar as solemnly as at a pulse. Enslaved unions live under a different roofline. They are called contubernia, cohabitations, recognized by households, neighbors, and hearts, but not by civil marriage law, connubium. Couples are paired, bless themselves with small ceremonies, raise children, quarrel about olives, and hope the master respects the door they've made. Many do. Some owners keep families intact, assign rooms together, and even arrange manumissions in clusters. Others sell spouses apart when debt, spite, or arithmetic decides. Historians still argue whether later imperial moralizing, letters of Hadrian or rescripts attributed to Antoninus Pius, meaningfully restrained the sale of close kin amongst slaves or mostly advised decency without enforcing it. Inscriptions preserve both tender epitaphs for concubinal partners and cold sale lists that read like storms. You sit by a cooking fire while a woman, enslaved but unbent, measures out barley porridge as if nutrition were a form of argument. Her partner returns from the mill and tips 2 coins into the peculium jar with the ceremony of a priest. They speak of a plan that sounds like a lullaby in prose. Save enough to buy her, free her, marry in law, free the children, buy a tiny shop that smells like bread. The plan is a staircase. Each step has a price. The prices wear dates that get smudged when winters run long. Sex here can be tenderness or leverage, and you hold the door at a respectful angle. Concubinage in Roman law is a recognized, lower status union between free persons who do not or cannot marry. Between a master and an enslaved woman, it isn't law so much as power-wearing euphemism. Sometimes it grows into manumission and marriage with legitimated children. Later imperial law, Constantine onward, will script legitimatio per subsequens matrimonium. Sometimes it ends with a will's kindness and a string of regrets. Sometimes it is simply the house's unspoken fact. You keep your language careful because the room is listening. Light joke 1, the kind you can tell while stirring a pot. A matron says love is a contract. The housekeeper replies that contracts need witnesses. The matron says, so does gossip. Children turn rules into faces. In a week you see a naming day, dies lustricus. When a freeborn baby receives a name, and if a boy, a tiny bulla hung at the neck like a promise. You also see a basket tucked discreetly by a doorway at dawn, a foundling left to fate and neighbors. Temples, midwives, and soft-hearted shopkeepers sometimes form rescue committees generous enough to embarrass the law. Sometimes a foundling is raised as a household slave and later manumitted, which is a crooked path to a decent ending. Quirky tidbit. Small lead swaddling bands stamped with good luck words turn up in burials. Somebody believed letters could hug. Freed couples negotiate their own geometry. Once free and properly married, they raise freeborn children, build dowries, and argue about tutors the way freeborn do, with affection sharpened by accounts. A free woman who ran a loom for a decade now runs a shop ledger like a general. A freedman notary drafts a marriage contract so balanced that the gods ask for a copy. The patron hovers politely, obsequium expected, opere scheduled, while the family decides on schools, apprenticeships, and whether the boy really needs a new cloak or just wishes to own one without oil stains. Status tangles show up at bedtime. An enslaved father with a free partner watches his free child sleep and smiles the complicated smile of someone who sees a ceiling lower over his own bed. A freed mother with 2 enslaved older children and 1 free infant counts coins loudly so hope can hear her. A master, not entirely unkind, writes a will freeing a woman he calls contubernalis and their children, because Roman sentiment often arrives wrapped in property law. Historians still argue whether affectionate language on epitaphs reflects widespread humane practice or is a polished veneer over harder routines. The safest sentence lets both be true on different streets. Household management makes intimacy bureaucratic. The steward, brisk, capable, keeps a log of births, deaths, rations, and days owed. He also keeps a private ledger of kindnesses dispensed, extra oil after fevers, afternoon off when a child teethed like a senator. He knows that mercy buys more obedience than iron does, and that families work better when they think tomorrow might be kinder than yesterday. Light joke 2, he marks. Teething loud on a tablet. A kitchen boy asks if the tablet can be found. The steward says the gods have already found everyone within hearing. Pregnancy and childbirth pull in the whole house. Experienced women, free, freed, enslaved, network faster than magistrates. Midwives arrive with baskets, oils, wool, and advice older than the city. The nurse warms water and old arguments. A teenage girl holds a hand and tries to look brave for both of them. Some owners advance rations or wine. Some insist on schedules. Good houses learn that babies refuse to read timetables. Bad houses pretend they can be taught. Law steps in at thresholds. If the mother is freed before the birth, the child is born free. If after, no retroactive magic applies. A free father can acknowledge children born of an enslaved partner and later, if marriage follows in a friendlier legal age, legitimize them. In the classical period, that ladder is rickety, firmer in late antiquity. Dowries, dotes, accompany free marriages. Gifts, donations, attempt to imitate or supplement when status makes dowry arithmetic awkward. Guardians, tutors, sign for minors and for sui juris women where the old forms still demand it, though by practice the signature often behaves like a seal rather than a veto. The city's gossip pages are written on walls and in markets. You hear of a master who refuses to separate a concubinal couple even when money shouts, of another who sells a child and learns that the neighborhood disapproves with its feet. Social sanction is not law, but in Rome it is sometimes louder. A baker offers day-old loaves cheap to a woman saving her peculium for her son. An aedile looks away from an after-hours market because he knows why the coins are being counted. Light joke 3. A barber says he can tell which men are newly married by how still they sit. The fuller says he can tell by whose tunics come in with wine instead of oil. You visit tombs, Rome's most honest diaries. A small stele. To Fortunatus, my contubernalis, who deserved better laws. Another. To Tyche, freed by my will, most faithful wife, who bore me 2 children and taught me thrift. The stones speak in perfect weather, but you read the storms between their lines. You also read pride, freedmen celebrating ingenuine children, freedwomen hailed as Pia and Phrygi, grandparents, freeborn now, thanking the gods in stone for an ordinary life their parents would have called miraculous. Everyday tactics keep families stitched. People move like chess. A woman gets hired in the same house as her partner by coincidence. A boy apprentices at the shop where his enslaved father runs the back room because the owner likes the lad's handwriting. A patron offers to be godfather at a naming day and then quietly pays for the midwife's apprentice so there will always be a second pair of hands. These small strategies build bridges where laws left rivers wide. Mainstream aside worth copying in neat hand. While enslaved unions lacked connubium, Roman law still recognized kinship for many purposes. Owners often recorded parentage. Sales sometimes specified not to separate mothers and nursing infants. Manumission could be structured to free a household together. Later imperial constitutions increased moral pressure to keep close kin together. Practice, as you've learned, depended on purse, temperament, and the weather of a city block. By evening you help hang a tiny amulet by a crib, a crescent moon charm for averting the evil eye, and you realize that most families, free or not, spend their genius on the same inventions: getting a child to sleep, editing adults' tempers, stretching stew, postponing despair. Legal status decides which doors open. Love decides which rooms feel like home. Historians still argue whether the intimacy of slaveholding households softened or sharpened the cruelty of the institution. The safest lullaby is to admit both possibilities and then promise, out loud if needed, to count coins with the people who plan stairs. You leave as the nurse hums a tune that knows all the verses and the steward blows out the last lamp in the corridor. On a shelf sits a jar half full of coins. On a peg hangs a bulla that will one day be traded for a toga. On a wall, a faded fresco shows a garden that promises green even in winter. Tomorrow you walk the quieter resistance, slowdowns, sabotage, networks, sanctuary, that families deploy when laws refuse to move quickly enough. For tonight you sleep with a sentence that fits under any roof: families are how time survives. You start the day by not starting it, at least not at the overseer's pace, and that, in Rome, is already a tactic. Everyday resistance moves like water. It seeps, it deters, it wears stone without shouting at it. You follow a crew into the vineyard and watch how people who know every knot in a lash also know every knot in a trellis, and how that knowledge lets them measure time on their own terms. The overseer counts rows, the workers count heartbeats. Today the rows will be just 1.5 slower than yesterday, for reasons that sound like weather and feel like will. Slow down is the first grammar. A pruner wraps fine twigs more carefully than necessary. A ditch team measures twice and cuts once as if geometry were a sacrament. A cart driver stops to fix a squeak that squeaked fine yesterday. Individually, nothing to punish. Together, a tempo the steward can't quite accelerate without admitting that human beings are not levers. Light joke 1. The steward says the sun is late. A worker looks at the sky and replies, "Then we are punctual." Sabotage is rarer, because broken tools sometimes break the wrong days, but you still see the artful misfit, a strap that snaps when it can safely be replaced on house expense, not on a back, a millstone that drifts slightly out of true until a forewoman with a good ear discovers it and earns credit for saving the bread from a future eccentricity. A boat's rope tied with a knot that will slip harmlessly to embarrass a lazy loader and teach him that weight has opinions. Nothing cruel, everything instructive. Networks hum where work does. A boy on an errand trades 3 figs for a rumor. The shop 3 alleys over manumits on the Saturnalia if the jar is full. A public fountain guard will listen if you mention the clerk with a limp. The priest at that small shrine can read petitions without reading them aloud. You watch signals pass, folded cloth on a shoulder, a phrase that sounds like weather. Wind from the south, a pause at a stall you don't need. The city is a radio without wires, and enslaved people learn to tune it long before magistrates learn to post neat schedules. Sanctuary stands at the edge of this map like a doorway that promises more corridor. An enslaved girl appeals at the base of an emperor's statue, collar bright as noon. The household may retrieve her, the magistrate may inquire. Sometimes the inquiry becomes transferred to a less theatrical master. Sometimes it becomes nothing and the door closes with the gentleness of bureaucracy that plans to be kind tomorrow. You don't bet on miracles, but you count them when they happen because counting is how hope remembers itself. Mainstream fact to set like a lantern. Literary and legal sources attest to the practice of slaves seeking refuge at imperial statues or in temples to petition against extreme cruelty, with governors empowered, under emperors like Antoninus Pius, to hear complaints and, in some cases, order sale or punishment of abusive owners. Paper can resist, too. A literate enslaved secretary drafts fair copies of documents that will later keep a promise honest. A manumission clause the master dictated while generous. A schedule of opera that is precise enough to prevent one more day, just one more, from multiplying. An inventory that proves the missing amphora went to taxes, not to rumor. Words are shields when they're written before the spear arrives. The secretary files duplicates in a place he jokingly calls tomorrow's drawer, which is funny because it works. Humor is resistance that doubles as oil for gears. A kitchen girl calls the lash. The steward's punctuation. It means the sentence is over and nothing useful will follow. A porter asks the edile to weigh the weights, loudly enough that the market enjoys the show. A bath attendant invents a new nickname for a cruel patron. Marcus asks again, and the name sticks so hard the man begins to ask less. Light joke 2. In a bakery, a worker posts a chalk sign. Oven hot, tempers cooler, and somehow both stay true until noon. Faith and festivals widen the seam. On certain days even stern houses treat time as a guest. The Saturnalia in particular flips chairs. Masters serve, slaves joke without consequence, collars wear wreaths, and a city exhausted by seriousness tries on laughter that fits surprisingly well. You're not naive. You know a day off is not a system. But memory of permission can lengthen spines the week after, and jokes told safely once are easier to tell softly later when they need to steer a mood. The peculium jar is the quietest rebellion in the house. Every coin saved is a refusal to let days be only days. Every extra errand accepted, every basket of herbs sold, every letter copied after hours turns obedience into a timeline with a date at the end. The jar is not always for self. Sometimes it buys a spouse's freedom first. Sometimes it pays a midwife everyone trusts. Sometimes it disappears into a neighbor's emergency and returns a month later with interest called gratitude. Historians still argue whether peculium primarily served owners' interests by incentivizing labor without wages, or slaves' autonomy by creating real leverage. The answer you hear in kitchens is both, pronounced with a grin that means, we know how to spend twice. Sabotage of information is more elegant than broken tools. A work list goes missing on a week when missing will harm only a cruel supervisor's schedule. A complaint letter, accidentally, reaches someone with a gentler pen. A rumor about a tax inspection travels blessedly fast toward a landlord who waters wine. These are small ethics in a city that prefers big speeches. They also keep certain hands from shaking. Religion doubles as encryption. Household Laras hear whispered commitments. If the jar reaches this mark, free her first. A tiny bronze Mercury receives a honey cake meant to sweeten a shopkeeper into fairness. A shared hymn signals that tonight the barracks will talk about saving, not running. Tomorrow the plan may change, but saving is a plan that doesn't wake the dogs. Quirky tidbit, some shop door charms, little terracotta eyes, were flipped upside down on nights when gossip needed to sleep, a sign to friends that news would wait until morning. In the public sphere, complaint can be art. A chorus of workers cough theatrically at the same point each day until the foreman learns that the dusting room needs water sprinkled. A line of men lingers by the scales whenever a certain buyer appears, a Greek chorus of eyebrows that makes him retrain his ethics. A collegium petition, written by a freedman with polite ferocity, lands on an edile's table with 50 thumbprints and just enough commas to look Roman. Light joke 3, the petition ends with, "We ask humbly for justice and, failing that, a new broom." Flight is the loudest resistance and therefore the rarest, because it ends either in freedom or in collars that jingle. I tried. Houses close ranks after escapes, cities notice. But even flight's failed rumors do work. They remind overseers that keys can be heavy. They remind masters that fear adds labor but subtracts skill. They remind neighbors that the person pouring wine also knows roads. When a runaway does make it, helped by a boatman who made a choice or a farmer who didn't count carefully in the fog, the story travels like a psalm. You don't ask for details. You listen to the song and let it help with mourning. Inside families, resistance is tenderness rationed with method. A mother keeps an older child awake until the father returns so the house will see their bond and hesitate next time offers whisper. A nurse misremembers which infant hates a certain cruel visitor so that he gets the colicky one, and he stops visiting. A steward's wife assigns roommates carefully. Pair a hot temper with a good joke and the temperature falls. None of this earns inscriptions. All of it earns sleep. Mainstream note to fold into your sleeve. Petitions from Roman Egypt and inscriptions across the empire show enslaved and freed people using written complaints, sanctuary appeals, guild advocacy, and patron channels to correct abuses. Governor's edicts and imperial rescripts occasionally answered with transfers, fines, or manumissions, evidence that everyday law, not only revolt and tragedy, moved needles. These mechanisms were uneven and depended on patronage and place, but they existed, which is how habit learns manners. Historians still argue whether such quiet strategies softened slavery's edge enough to call Roman bondage paternalistic in practice, or whether the softness merely hid the blade. You've watched both. Houses where fines replaced scars and kitchens where jokes replaced shouting, and also fields where iron wrote too many sentences. The safer wisdom is to respect competence wherever it appears. People built pockets of room inside walls and taught children to keep them tidy. As dusk lines the street with lamp halos, you watch a last act of everyday defiance. A small bench placed under a wall where workers gather for 10 minutes before curfew. Someone tells a 3-part joke about a praetor, a donkey, and a missing measure of grain. Someone else counts coins into the jar with a tap for each year they intend to survive. An old woman hums the second verse of the harvest song alone, and 3 others join her without looking up. The overseer passes, sees only a bench and a song, and keeps walking. Tomorrow the bench will be moved 3 doors down, because benches that never move tend to be noticed. You go to sleep thinking not of chains or edicts but of knots tied loosely enough to come undone at the right moment. Resistance, you've learned, loves small, repeatable acts, a slower row, a better copy, a saved coin, a rehearsed rumor, a doorway that knows your name. Tomorrow the horizon widens into open revolt. Sicily, Capua, the road where Spartacus taught Rome to feel afraid of its own arithmetic. For tonight, listen to the quiet victory of a schedule edited by the people who must live inside it. You walk with the dusk wind across a Sicilian field that remembers more footsteps than harvests, and you feel how a countryside can hold its breath. Revolt is not thunder at first. It is the quiet arithmetic of too many collars per hillside, too many whips per granary, too many prayers that return unopened. You kneel, lift a vine twig, and imagine the whisper passing along rows. Tonight, not tomorrow, and the way men and women who have been organizing small hopes for years suddenly organize their feet. The first spark the source's love is a showman prophet named Yunus near Enna, 135 BC. He entertains masters with jokes and visions, then entertains history by opening his mouth and blowing out a lick of fire. Mainstream anchor for the ledger. Ancient writers date the First Servile War in Sicily to 135 to 132 BC. They name Yunus, styled King Antiochus, after rebellion, as a leader alongside the formidable field captain Cleon, and they trace the uprising to the island's dense latifundia and the import of war captives who turned fields into barracks without salaries. You picture the first night, kitchen knives hidden in baskets, iron pulled from plows, A handful of guards disarmed by surprise and the sudden realization that numbers make manners. The island burns slowly, not as a single blaze but as pockets of decision. Farm gangs link up. Shepherd bands, already half illegal under harsh game laws, move like smoke. The rebels seize Enna, then Tauromenium. They mint a kind of authority out of necessity. Leaders, courts, rules harsher than they wish to forestall and discipline harsher still. You see night fires in a ring, a woman counting the provisions into 10-day parcels, a boy sharpening a sickle he hates. Light joke one, an old shepherd eyes the new king, and mutters that sheep dislike crowns. The new king nods, because he understands sheep and implies he'll take advice. What the island learns, Rome remembers. Sicily feeds the city. Revolt starves it. Roman forces arrive, improve painfully, and over grim months and then years, tighten sieges. Tauromenium falls by hunger. Enna falls by betrayal. The sources narrate with a relish you choose not to share aloud. The survivors scatter. The experiment of a slave kingdom collapses under the weight of logistics, and the empire's habit of persistence. The countryside exhales, but not in relief. It exhales the way lungs do after a cough. A decade later, 104 to 100 BC, the fields breathe the same bad air again. Second Servile War. Salvius, styling himself Tryphon, rallies. Athenian fights like a man who remembers last time's mistakes. They carve temporary space from familiar hills, draw in the desperate and the skilled, and write rules that look, in outline, like order. Historians still argue whether these Sicilian kingdoms built coherent administrations, taxes, courts, supply chains, or whether later storytellers retrofitted bureaucracy onto bands that lived week to week. The coin hoards, the siege traces, and the repeated Roman campaigns suggest enough organization to make Rome sweat, and enough fragility to make surrender a season away. You stand on a ridge at dawn and hear nothing at all. Only the long silence that follows defeat. The rebels are crushed, some leaders executed, others paraded. Thousands return to chains whose links now feel heavier because they have been weighed against something else. The island goes back to harvests and to the wary glances you learn from storms. Then the peninsula inhales, and a different kind of spark lands in Capua. 73 BC, a training school for gladiators, a house that collects talented desperation. Spartacus, a Thracian by the sources' consensus, and a few dozen companions break from their ludus with kitchen knives and skewers. They find wagon-loads of weapons that do not ask for pedigrees. They run uphill to Vesuvius, where vines and gravity teach them strategy. Mainstream fact to pin in neat hand, the Third Servile War, Spartacus revolt, runs 73 to 71 BC. Early on, the rebels famously escape a Roman cordon by sliding down the volcano's steeper slopes using ropes plaited from grapevines, then ambushing their besiegers from the rear, a maneuver that reads like a field's revenge on geometry. What begins as flight becomes recruitment. Rural slaves join. Herdsmen arrive with dogs and grudges. A scattering of free poor men who like the sound of plunder become a problem that leadership tries to solve with rules. The numbers swell, thousands, then tens of thousands, figures that move as fog on ancient pages. You watch camp discipline grow with painful clarity. Weapons sorted by length. Watches set by the moon. A council of captains whose quarrels make the night long because democracies born in emergency are earnest and exhausting. Light joke 2. A blacksmith hammered into a general complains the swords are too soft. A cook promoted to quartermaster says the men are too Both learned to salt more and quench colder. Spartacus beats small Roman forces, then larger ones. Consular armies falter before a coalition that has trained in fields rather than in books. The rebels travel south, north, south again, a map that scholars still argue about and lines that look like the city's own indecision. Historians still argue whether Spartacus truly intended to cross the Alps and disperse, home by home, life by life, or whether he always knew the Alps were a mirage compared to Rome's reach. They debate whether he aimed at Italy's social order or only at exit. The safest sentence is that a moving mass with many hungers contains several plans, and the leader adapted because survival prefers verbs to slogans. Winter hits strategy the way it hits vines. The rebels barter with coastal traders for salt, iron, rumor. They consider Sicily, again that island, as an escape corridor if ships can be found and treachery can be proved false. Pirates flirt, promise, fail, as pirates do in literature and life. Meanwhile, Rome finds an adult for the room, Marcus Licinius Crassus, very rich, very serious, with legions that learn quickly and a taste for discipline no one remembers fondly. Decimation appears, every 10th man in a disgraced unit executed by lot, a ritual the modern ear flinches at and the ancient army remembers as a medicine prepared with a club. You imagine the silence in a tent after lots are drawn, and you decide history does not require you to narrate that silence loudly. Crassus pens the rebels into the toe of Italy, an earthwork wall from sea to sea across the Rhegium Peninsula, ditches and palisades announcing that numbers can be trapped if wood and wool are large enough. The rebels break through once in winter's fury. Later they fracture, some groups peeled away by hunger, fear, or the old gravitational pull of every man for himself. Spartacus gathers a corps, turns, and fights a last set of battles, brilliant then desperate. He reportedly cuts his way toward Crassus himself, wounded, unhorsed, refusing to be a chapter title without a verb. He dies in the crush with no theatrical last line. The line belongs to the Appian Way, where Rome nails its lesson. Quirky tidbit to set gently, ancient accounts put 6,000 rebel bodies crucified along the Appian Road from Capua to Rome, a morbid avenue of policy and pedagogy. It is the single ugliest way a republic can say, "We won and we want you to walk carefully." And it worked as intended. Travelers saw and understood. Pompey, returning from Spain, helps mop up stragglers and claims a share of credit with political timing that would make a baker envious. Crassus glowers. The city applauds. The poor remain poor. The fields remain wide. You try to breathe through the images and remember that revolt, even when heroic, writes most of its sentences on bodies that wanted ordinary days. A woman sells her bracelets to buy salt for a camp and then never goes home. A boy watches his father learn to hold a spear and learns too late what history means. A shepherd finds that the freedom of hills is not the same as the freedom of cities and that both are expensive. And yet, Rome learns. Not necessarily the lesson modern comfort wishes it had learned, but aversion, owner's fear. Governors prune cruelty that invites conspiracy. Manumission becomes, in some hands, a more deliberate policy. Collars still jingle, but some are set aside because an overseer has decided fines and songs are cheaper than chains and funerals. Light joke 3, small and survivable. A senator vows to reform the morals of the countryside. A farmer replies that the countryside prefers rain. Historians still argue whether these wars were truly slave wars, in pure category or broader coalitions, enslaved, free poor, shepherds, deserters, fusing grievance into momentum. They debate numbers, routes, motives, whether Spartacus read Greek philosophy at bedtime or merely learned logistics from necessity. The scrolls disagree as scrolls often do. The fields keep the simpler memory. Sometimes people who bend all day decide to bend the map instead. Night folds over the ridge, and the wind carries the faintest sound of iron, tools, not chains. And you let yourself imagine a camp where someone has told a joke after the guard was posted. Revolt is a terrible teacher. It costs everything and refunds little. But it carved a warning into Rome's ledger so deep even careful erasers could not smooth it. Build a world where the only doors are markets and courts, not barracks and walls. Tomorrow you will trace how the economy and morality tried to do that. Prophets' stubborn arithmetic, philosophers' thinner arguments, and the long, conflicted feelings of elites who liked virtue as long as it didn't interrupt lunch. You sit with a merchant's ledger and a philosopher's scroll and realize that Rome can hold two entirely different objects in the same hand without dropping either. Profit and conscience, grain and grief, arithmetic and ethics. Your job tonight is to listen while both speak, and to keep your voice low enough that numbers don't feel mocked and virtue doesn't feel unemployed. You open the ledger first because it shouts more quietly. Grain is the city's mood ring. Sicily, Africa Proconsularis, later Egypt. These regions feed Rome with schedules that can make or unmake politics. Latifundia spread where profit and conquest shake hands. Slave labor makes yields predictable when the weather cooperates, and overseers fear thin margins more than bad poems. Owners calculate capitale, purchase price, rations, clothing, replacement rate, expected output. A trained vine dresser with scars that speak competence is an asset, in lines that never say the word. A woman with deft fingers at the loom is throughput, with a name omitted for space. Mainstream peg, written in neat hand. Literary sources, Cato, Varro, Columella, and vast epigraphy point to enslaved labor underpinning agricultural and many urban enterprises. Africa becomes a granary under imperial administration, its estates and shipping rhythms tied to annona distributions that keep Rome from discovering how hungry it can get. Urban prophets sing the same key at a quicker tempo. Bakeries scale with donkey mills and chain shifts. Brickwork stamp names that read like balance sheets baked in clay. Shipping syndicates hedge storms with contracts your Section 10 notary could recite in his sleep. Enslaved specialists, bookkeepers, clerks, foremen, make free profit for free masters by paid skill they do not own. The irony is not subtle. Rome prefers its irony seasoned, not hidden. You flip to a column labeled losses, and trace the small mercies that are also efficiencies, fines instead of stripes because welts reduce yield, peculium because hope costs less than iron, manumitting the steady steward at 50 because a trusted freed agent will keep buying from you and won't steal the customers who prefer his jokes to your prices. Light joke 1. A shipowner says pirates cost him sleep. The accountant says late fees do. The baker down the street says both are amateurs compared to rain. Morality clears its throat from a different room. Philosophers, Stoics especially, insist that all humans share reason. Slavery is a matter of law, not nature. Seneca writes letters that fold pity into pragmatism. Dine with your slaves, speak gently. Remember you could be reversed by fortune. Musonius Rufus sounds like a stern uncle who nonetheless remembers birthdays. Epictetus, once enslaved himself, teaches freedom as an internal craft, a discipline that no master can confiscate. You hear the cadence. Be decent because it is rational, not because it improves output, though it does. Historians still argue whether such philosophy meaningfully changed practice outside elite circles. Did dinner invitations and better manners penetrate barracks and mills? Or did they remain salon whether among readers who signed their letters and their manumissions on the same parchment? The documentary Breeze suggests both epitaphs of affectionate patrons and freed dependents, and also auction placards that read like recipes for despair. The Stoic seed germinates. The field remains mostly the same field. Religion adds its own pressure. In the High Empire, traditional piety provides rituals of manumission that feel like grace structured by law. In late antiquity, Christian emperors turn up the rhetoric. Bishops preach the equality of souls, manumission at altars multiplies. Laws accumulate that temper cruelty and add protections, even as church estates also own and manage enslaved labor with a thoroughness that suggests virtue learns bookkeeping quickly. Mainstream fact to file. Imperial constitutions from Constantine onward include measures affecting slavery, facilitating manumission in churches, limiting separations of close kin, penalizing extreme cruelty. While the socio-economic reliance on bound labor persists in new administrative clothing, you return to the ledger and see a note in the margin. Bonus Annona promised, delay due to river, which translates to politics unstable. Economic shocks make ethics vivid, famine magnifies every decision. War breaks chains and then forges others. Plagues erase shortages and then create new ones. In such seasons, some owners sell human beings to cover losses. Others free the steady and keep the cynical, a tactic that turns out to be self-correcting when the cynical continue to be cynical. Light joke 2. A steward advises buying more jars. The master asks if jars increase yield. The steward says, they increase patience, which yields yield. Pricing the unpriceable breeds intellectual allergies. Jurists wrap their discomfort in competence. Actio redhibitoria and quanti minores make markets honest without giving lectures. Lex Aquilia prices loss when a neighbor kills your cook, because grief in Rome still files receipts. Philosophers try a different abacus. Can a just person own another? If yes, how must he behave? If no, how does he eat in a world arranged by chains? The answers come in paragraphs that feel like bridges over rivers that keep rising. Quirky tidbit. Some household inventories list enslaved people alongside furniture with a poetic precision that betrays affection inside commodification. Drosus, the quick one, who reads, Ligda, who sings while weaving, as if naming, even in lists, were a small rebellion against reduction. Another, stamped bread loaves from Pompeii bear bakery names and sometimes initials of enslaved workers. You imagine a small pride at seeing your letter leave an impression on crust. You test a long-standing question with your thumb. Did slavery suppress innovation? Historians still argue whether cheap coerced labor discouraged labor-saving tech or whether Romans innovated when scale rewarded it. Barbigals mills, water-lifting devices in mines, cranes in ports. The city looks like a counterexample to the idleness thesis. Mechanization appears where the math smiles and disappears where maintenance would eat the smiles. The safer answer is regional. Africa's estates invest in presses. Alls invests in water. Small shops invest in hands because hands survive better than gears in alleys that flood. Moral economy shows up not in treatises but in habits. An owner who keeps families together via explicit clauses gains a reputation that purchases loyalty at a discount. A shop that manumits on anniversaries recruits talent without posters. A city that funds sanctuary and prosecutes cruelty beyond custom. Discovers that brooms push better when wielded by people who believe the street belongs to them. 2. This is not altruism. It is enlightened selfishness with better lighting. Yet it smells enough like virtue to make sleep arrive sooner. You walk past the slave market again, section 1 like a soft echo, and watch a buyer ask not only, "What can he do?" but, "What does he hope to do?" A question ridiculous in commerce and essential in households. He pays slightly more for a literate boy who wants to be a scribe. Later that boy becomes a free notary who writes wills that keep the buyer's grandchildren from suing each other over sandals. Economics calls this foresight. Morality calls it respect. Rome calls it Tuesday. Charity nibbles at structures it cannot swallow. Freedmen endow collegia funds for funerals and dowries. Matrons sponsor foundlings with a seriousness that embarrasses some husbands into matching contributions. Temples run food distributions on cold mornings when philosophers are still warming up. These acts do not dismantle bondage. They build platforms inside it where decency can stand and wave until the wind chooses a better direction. Light joke 3. A guild votes whether to call their relief fund mercy or mutual aid. The secretary proposes, "Bring a cup," and the name sticks because language follows appetite. Mainstream aside to keep your map honest. The Roman economy integrates slavery with tenancy, wage labor, and family firms. Manumission rates appear high by comparative standards. Freedmen shaped urban economies disproportionately. Yet the aggregate surplus from coerced labor remains a backbone that emperors ride and moralists merely sand. The contradictions are structural, not accidental. Policies nibble, cultures nudge, crises shove, and progress, when it appears, prefers a shuffle to a march. As night leans in, you place the ledger on the philosopher's scroll and notice they weigh about the same. Profit without conscience degrades. Conscience without budget starves. Rome survives by making both share a table with jars of oil and a lamp that does not complain. Historians still argue whether the empire's small reforms, legal protections, sanctuary, manumission channels, constituted a genuine moral arc or an elegant maintenance plan. Your ears, after 14 sections, hear a thin upward tune. Not enough, not evenly applied, sometimes cynical, but audible. You end on a bench where a freedwoman counts coins for a girl's dowry and a steward writes a promise to free an older porter next spring. If the gods and the weather agree. The philosopher passing by nods and says something about virtue. The merchant nods and calculates interest that will not hurt. The girl tries on a simple ring and laughs because it is slightly too big. Tomorrow, late antiquity will adjust the lighting. Christian rhetoric, imperial reforms, shifts from chattel to colony, new words for old dependencies. And you will end with a wind down that lets the tools sleep and the jars settle. For now, let the ledger close gently and the scroll curl by habit, and keep the sentence that tastes true. Decency is not a cost center. You wake to bells that weren't here before, bronze voices that fold dawn into prayer, and you notice how the city's soundscape has changed while its streets still remember every footstep. Late antiquity does this, adjusts the lighting, moves the furniture, leaves the floor plan. You walk along a colonnade where a bishop's procession passes a tax official, where a monk nods to a notary, where the market smells both of incense and of onions, and you listen for how bondage shifts costume without leaving the stage. Christian rhetoric rises first, not as a shout but as a steady homily. Bishops preach that souls are equal even when tunics are not, that masters must treat servants as brothers in Christ, that cruelty dishonors both victim and household altar. The law listens sometimes. Mainstream anchor to place on the shelf beside your lamp. From Constantine onward, imperial constitutions permit manumission in churches, a liberty of the altar. Make it easier to free the sick and the dying, censure extreme brutality, and increasingly pressure owners not to separate close kin. A master can still own. A master is warned how to behave. You hear a new voice in rescripts, piety adding verbs to prudence. Walk a little and you reach an apse where a ritual unfolds with a transparency late antiquity enjoys. A slave kneels, a patron, now, Christian gentleman, as well as master, pronounces freedom in the presence of clergy and friends. The bishop notes the date. The congregation murmurs amen. That sounds like a small weather change. The clerk writes a copy for the city archive and another for the church chest. Quirky tidbit. In some dioceses, it became custom to post manumission notes on church doors during Easter week, where the wax seals caught spring light and children traced the ribbons with sticky fingers after honey cake. Yet as collars loosen in some rooms, new ties tighten in fields. You turn off the main road and find tenants, coloni, binding themselves to land and landlord with contracts that behave like weathered rope. They are not slaves. They have names on leases, families and cottages, suits they can bring when rent bites too hard. But edicts begin to freeze them in place. Don't flee the estate, don't abandon furrows, because tax lists prefer people who stay where scribes left them. The colonate thickens, obligation to soil rather than to a person, dues measured in kind and days, inheritance of tenancy like a surname. Historians still argue whether this shift represents genuine mitigation, a move from chattel to a less severe dependence, or a rebrand, a restraint that traded collars for boundaries and told tired farmers to be grateful for the new vocabulary. You carry both possibilities like weights that balance a scale uneasily. In cities, public slavery persists but wears new uniforms. Church properties hire and own. Imperial bureaus reorganize. Curial obligations, those local council duties that felt like burdens disguised as honors, push families into odd shapes. An imperial edict scolds a governor who flogged too readily. Another orders fugitives back to estates that complain of empty rows. You observe the tone, emperors as schoolmasters, stern, sometimes merciful, chronically practical. The old ius civil still hums, now accompanied by canon law's chant, synods laying down pastoral policies that occasionally travel into civil courts by way of shared personnel, because late antiquity loves men who speak fluent scripture and statute. You sit in a scriptorium where a monk copies a homily on charity across from a jurist who is abridging gaze for students who will call themselves notaries in 5 years. The jurist glances at the monk's page and steals a sentence for a preface. The monk glances at the jurist's page and steals a structure for a sermon. Between them lies a pile of manumission formularies, some old Roman, some recently baptized, ready to serve households that wish to honor both civic custom and Sunday. Light joke 1. The monk says parchment is dear. The jurist says so is justice. The abbot mutters that both are cheaper than bad bookkeeping. In the East, continuity flexes. The Byzantine administration keeps slavery on its books, trims some edges, and writes in Greek with a clarity that can be chilly. Justinian arrives like a librarian king in the 6th century and gathers laws into the Corpus Juris Civilis, Code, Digest, Institutes, folding centuries of practice into an authoritative bookshelf. Mainstream fact, crisp as a rubric, Justinian's compilers preserve classical doctrines on status, manumission, and obligations while sprinkling Christian rationales. They prune the thicket of half-freed statuses, simplify manumission routes, and pronounce mercy with imperial grammar. You read an excerpt that punishes killing a slave without cause and feel how the earlier tone sharpened by Antoninus Pius has been packaged for export. In the West, the furniture rearranges more dramatically, but Roman drawers still slide. Visigoths, Burgundians, later Lombards, each kingdom writes its laws, each keeps a Roman law for Romans. In some form, the Lex Romana Visigothorum, for instance, allowing former provincials to live under edited echoes of Ulpian while their neighbors cite new kings. The patchwork keeps people fed on predictability. Manumission formulas survive. Debt rules survive. The idea that law can be copied survives. Slavery persists. So does a habit of freeing at wills and altars. A bishop scolds a count for separating a mother and child. A count replies that rents must be paid. The bishop writes to the king. The child grows. The story acquires footnotes. You pause by a farmhouse where a colonist repairs a door while explaining to his daughter why the threshold belongs to them but the soil belongs to the count. He sounds like a professor who never met a library. He uses proverbs where you would use clauses. He teaches her which days are theirs and which are the landlord's, which tangles a city jurist would call opere culinari. When he mentions a cousin who ran away east to the coast and found work as a stevedore paid in coin, the air tightens, hope and danger in the same sentence. Historians still argue whether late Roman and post-Roman labor law permitted meaningful mobility for tenants, or merely painted gates to look like horizons. The letters between bishops and officials show escapes, restitutions, bargains, a mosaic that refuses a single caption. In towns, freedmen's grandchildren, now simply townsmen, sit in councils, run guilds, and sponsor saints' days with a confidence that would have stunned the stewards of Section 3. Their Latin bristles with Christian borrowings and late antique slang. Their ledgers look familiar. They manumit fewer people because fewer are purchased. They bind more apprentices and hire more tenants. They still hang wreaths when a servant of 20 years receives a parchment of freedom at Pentecost, and someone still cries by the fountain, which means the old ritual survived with a new fragrance. Quirky tidbit. Some churches kept a locked chest called an arca libertatis, a freedom box, where manumission records slept under two keys, one held by a priest, one by a deacon. On feast days, children were allowed to knock on the lid 3 times, to wake mercy, which worked as theology and as theater. The lid never answered, but documents inside did. How does it end? Slowly, then not at all, then differently. Slavery dwindles unevenly in some regions. In others, fresh captures and border wars refill markets that never mailed resignation letters. The colonate matures into medieval serfdom in some places, fizzles into tenancies in others. New dependencies, clientage, commendation, grow where old ones wither. The habit of manumission continues as a good deed and a clever policy. The habit of owning people persists where profit and war refuse to retire. Late antiquity did not abolish bondage. It reweighted the mix. More bonds to land and lord, fewer collars in some streets, persistent collars in others, law speaking softer, scripture speaking often, practice negotiating with both. Historians still argue whether the Christian empire fundamentally humanized the slave system or merely wrapped it in sermons, whether the colonnade was a safety net or a net, whether Justinian's simplifications helped ordinary people or mostly pleased professors. You, committed to sleep as well as to sentences, take the night's modest victory. More recognized doors to freedom, more shame attached to cruelty, more paperwork you can wave at a bad day, and a quieter confidence that tomorrow's law will remember today's names. You end by the same fountain where Section 6 taught you gratitude. A deacon ladles water for a woman whose hands know both harvest and prayer. A notary folds a parchment that says libertas for one person and perhaps a little more room for 2 or 3 beside her. The bell that began your morning taps once for vespers. You feel the city prepared to sleep with new songs layered on old streets. You have walked from chains to contracts to collars to cords, and the thread through them all was human attention, counting, saving, speaking up, writing down. Let the thread rest now. Let the city dim until arches soften and the aqueduct becomes a line the moon draws with a fingertip. You have listened to markets speak in lists, to households speak in recipes, to fields speak in rows, and to laws speak in clauses that tried, sometimes earnestly, sometimes politely, to keep harm from becoming habit. Now let speech slow. Imagine parchment cooling after the last line, the stylus laid beside it like a tired bird. Picture a key set on a sill and not needed for the rest of the night. Breathe in the mild smells of late antiquity, lamp oil, bread, a little incense trailing home behind a coat. Breathe out the dust of roads you walked, the auction plank, the vineyard path, the mill's flour, the barracks straw, the church threshold where a ribbon swung on a seal. With each breath, let categories unknit into simple shapes. Master and slave become 2 silhouettes sitting on a step, sharing a loaf in quiet. Colonist and count become a field in morning light and a ledger closed for Sunday. Jurist and bishop become 2 readers under the same lamp, pages reflecting in their eyes like small, calm fires. If stray images linger, the iron collar with a bell, the earthwork across a peninsula, the docket that once read too many names, let them drift to the edges like boats, moored for the season. Leave in the harbor only the gentler pictures, a nurse looping a child's tunic so stairs are safer, a steward choosing fines over welts, a jar of coins that finally weighs as much as a door, a clerk writing libertas with slow, careful letters because the word deserves to be legible forever. Let your breath lengthen, your shoulders fall, and your room take on the deep hush a city makes when most people have decided to be kind tomorrow. If a bell sounds, hear it as a lullaby, the last appointment of the day kept by sleep itself. Close your eyes. The lamps will mind themselves. The law will keep time until morning.